The merchants of Milner Creek did not turn Clara Whitmore away quietly. That was what people never talked about afterward. Not the cold, not the storm, not even the 5 children she was dragging through knee-deep snow at 2 in the morning. What they never talked about was how Gerald Foss, who owned the only general store between the mountain and the valley floor, opened his door, looked at her, looked at the infant bundled against her chest, and then stepped back inside and turned the lock. He did not say a word. He just turned the lock. And then he pulled the curtain. Clara stood on that porch for a full minute. The baby had stopped crying an hour ago, which was worse than crying. Her oldest, Thomas, 11 years old, and trying very hard not to show that his feet had gone numb inside his boots, put his hand on her arm without speaking. She did not move. She just stared at that curtain and breathed steam into the black air. Then she picked up her bundle and walked back into the snow. If you were standing on that road tonight, watching a woman carry a dying infant through a Montana blizzard while 4 children stumbled behind her in the dark, would you have opened your door, or would you have pulled the curtain too? Before we go further, if stories like this one find something in you that won't let go, please subscribe to this channel so you never miss another one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that road, because what happened next changed everything. Well, the winter of 1887 came to northern Montana. The way bad news comes, early, hard, and without any sympathy for who was in the way. By the first week of December, the passes were already buried under 4 feet of snow. The creek had frozen solid from bank to bank, and every rancher within 30 miles had pulled his family close and his shutters tighter. It was the kind of cold that didn't just chill you, it got inside your thinking, made everything feel smaller and farther away than it actually was. Ethan Callahan had been living inside that cold for 3 years. Not just the weather cold, the other kind. The kind that moves in after loss and doesn't bother to introduce itself, just rearranges the furniture and stays. He was 38 years old and looked 10 years older, not because of hard living exactly, but because of hard stillness. There's a difference. Hard living marks a man on the outside. Hard stillness marks him somewhere deeper, in the set of his jaw and the way he doesn't finish sentences anymore because there's no one to finish them for. Ethan had the look of a man who had made peace with a life that had already peaked and was now just working out its remaining obligations. His cabin sat at the base of a ridge about 4 miles north of the town of Milner Creek, set back from the road in a stand of lodgepole pines that broke most of the wind, but not enough of the silence. He had built it himself 12 years ago with his wife Margaret, watching from a camp chair and telling him every 20 minutes that the east wall was crooked. The east wall was not crooked. He had checked it 4 times. But he had never told her that because watching her squint at it with that measuring look on her face had been one of his favorite things about being alive. Margaret had been gone 3 years. Their son Daniel, who would have been 7 now, had been gone 3 years and 2 months. Ethan did not think about either of them if he could help it, and he had gotten quite good at not helping it. The cabin had what he needed: a wood stove that worked, a cot, a shelf of supplies he'd rationed out through the previous 2 winters with the kind of grim precision that made his neighbors shake their heads. He had a horse named Bruiser, who was old and bad-tempered and understood nothing about human grief, which Ethan found restful. He had 4 chickens and a dog named Scout, who had gone half-deaf the previous winter and now slept in front of the stove with the self-satisfied certainty of an animal who had outlasted everyone's expectations. That was his life. Contained, manageable, almost entirely without surprise. He had come to prefer it that way. On the night Clara Whitmore knocked on his door, Ethan was not asleep. He rarely slept well before 3 in the morning, and he had stopped fighting it years ago. He sat at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a piece of harness leather he was pretending to mend. Scout was twitching in his sleep near the stove, chasing something in a dream, his back legs pumping slowly against the floorboards. It was 11 minutes past 2 when he heard the sound. He almost didn't register it as a knock. It was too faint, too irregular, more like something bumping against the door in the wind, or a branch that had come loose somewhere up on the roof. He set down the harness and listened. Scout's ears lifted, though the dog didn't wake. Then it came again. Harder this time. 3 blows, each one carrying the particular desperation of someone who was not sure they had the strength for a fourth. Ethan was on his feet before he had consciously decided to move. He did not grab his rifle, not his first instinct, which told him something, though he couldn't have said what. He crossed to the door in 4 steps, shot the bolt back, and pulled it open. The cold hit him like a physical blow. She was standing maybe 2 feet back from the door, as though she had knocked and then stepped away to give him room to say no. That detail stayed with him later, that she had stepped back. She was braced for rejection. She had the posture of someone who had been turned away enough times in the past few hours that she had built the expectation into her bones. She was young, maybe late 20s, though the cold and the exhaustion had aged her face into something harder to read. She had a wool coat that was not warm enough for this weather, dark with melted snow across the shoulders, and she was holding an infant bundled against her chest with both arms wrapped tight around it. The infant was not moving. Ethan noticed that immediately, before he noticed anything else. Behind her, staggered across his porch, and the 3 steps leading up to it, were 4 children. The oldest was a boy, maybe 10 or 11, with his arms around the 2 middle children in a way that suggested he'd been doing that for a while. The youngest, a girl about 4 years old, was sitting down on the bottom step with her eyes half closed, which was worse than if she'd been crying. "Please." Her voice was almost nothing, not a whisper exactly. A whisper has texture. This was just air shaped into a word. I'm sorry the baby isn't." She stopped, looked at him. And then, with the exhaustion of someone who had been preparing arguments for hours and had finally run completely out of them, she said, "Take my children. Save them. I don't care what happens to me." Ethan Callahan stood in the doorway of his cabin at 2 in the morning in the coldest winter in 6 years, and he looked at this woman and her children, and for one terrible second he felt the pull of every instinct that had governed the last 3 years of his life. The instinct toward smallness, toward manageable, toward a life sized exactly to what he could afford to lose. And then he looked at the little girl sitting on the bottom step with her eyes going heavy. "Get inside," he said. "All of you, now." He did not wait to see if she moved. He went straight to the child on the step, picked her up. She weighed almost nothing, which frightened him, and carried her inside. Her feet were bare. He had not seen that from the door. Her feet were bare and the color of old ash, and he felt his throat close around something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but lived somewhere between the two. He put her directly in front of the stove, turned to find the others filing through the door. The oldest boy herding the middle 2, a girl and a younger boy, with the calm efficiency of someone who had been the responsible one for a long time. Clara came in last, still holding the infant, and Ethan pulled the door shut behind her and threw the bolt. "Sit," he said to the children. Then he looked at Clara. "Let me see the baby." She hesitated for just a fraction of a second. The instinct of a mother who has been holding that child for hours and whose arms have formed a kind of fortress around it. And then she held it out to him. The infant was a boy. Couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 months old. His lips had a faint blue tinge and his breathing was shallow and rapid, but he was breathing. Ethan pressed the back of his hand to the baby's forehead, then his cheek, then the back of his neck. Cold. Too cold. But not gone. "How long has he been like this?" "Since maybe 2 hours ago he stopped crying. Before that he was—" She stopped, pressed her lips together hard. "He was loud." "That's good. Loud is good." Ethan was already moving toward the cot, pulling back the blankets. He laid the infant down on the flannel sheets, then stripped off his own outer shirt, the heavy wool one he'd been wearing since October, and began tucking it around the baby, concentrating the warmth. "What's his name?" "Samuel." "Okay, Samuel's going to be all right. He's cold, not frozen." He wasn't entirely sure of that, but he said it with the kind of flatness that precluded argument, and he watched some of the rigid desperation go out of her shoulders. "Come here. Sit down next to him. Body heat." She moved. She was better at taking direct instruction than most people, which he registered as a practical quality before he registered it as anything else. He turned to the children. Scout had woken up and was investigating the newcomers with the cautious interest of an animal who had not seen children in a very long time. The oldest boy was watching Ethan with a wariness that had nothing childlike about it, the flat assessment of someone who had learned not to trust adults quickly. "What are your names?" Ethan said. A pause. Then the boy said, Thomas, that's Nora. He pointed to the girl, maybe 7, who was pressed against his side. And that's Will. The younger boy, maybe 8, had found the dog and was gripping Scout's fur with both hands. Scout, for his part, appeared to be accepting this with great dignity. And her? Ethan nodded toward the 4-year-old in front of the stove, who had opened her eyes and was staring at him with the uncomplicated directness of a very young child. Lucy, the boy said. She's 4. Okay. Ethan crouched down to Lucy's level. Her feet were still the wrong color. He got up, went to the trunk at the foot of the cot, and dug out 2 pairs of thick wool socks. His own, far too large, but dry and clean. He came back and knelt in front of her. I'm going to put these on your feet, he said. They're going to feel scratchy. Is that okay? She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. He pulled the socks on gently, working them up past her ankles. Her feet were colder than her face, but he could feel some response in them. A faint tension as the warmth registered. Not frostbitten. Close, but not there. The others need dry things too, he said, without looking up. He was aware of Thomas watching him from across the room. There's a chest against the far wall. Open it. Take what you need. Thomas did not move immediately. He was a boy who had learned to evaluate offers before accepting them, which made Ethan think about what the last several hours must have looked like from Thomas's perspective. Doors opening and closing, adults looking at his mother and then looking away. It's all right, Clara said quietly from the cot. Do what he says. Thomas moved. Ethan sat back on his heels and looked at the room. His supplies, which he had rationed with a miser's precision for 1 man through 1 Montana winter, were now looking at 6 people. He counted automatically: the dried beef, the flour, the canned goods on the shelf, the coffee, the sugar, the potatoes in the cold box, the chickens outside who were now more valuable than they had been an hour ago. The math was not comfortable. He did it anyway, added it up in his head with the same bleak accuracy he brought to everything. It would be tight, very tight. But it was not impossible, if the winter didn't run much past March, if his snares held, if he could get to town before the next storm came down. A lot of ifs. He stood, went to the shelf, took down the pot, and started making something hot. Oats, because he had plenty of them and they were fast. He worked without talking and nobody talked to him, which he appreciated. Clara was murmuring something low to Samuel on the cot. Will had apparently reached some kind of agreement with Scout and was now sitting on the floor with the dog's head in his lap. Nora had fallen asleep sitting up against the wall, and Thomas had pulled a blanket from the chest and covered her without being asked. Ethan noticed that, filed it away. He ladled the oats into 5 bowls. He went without, which wasn't heroism, just practicality. He wasn't hungry, and brought them over. Lucy ate with both hands gripped around the bowl, which was not how a child eats when they've eaten recently. Thomas ate with the methodical focus of someone who has made the decision to refuel without letting themselves feel how hungry they are. Clara did not eat. She was watching Samuel. Eat, Ethan said, setting a bowl next to her on the cot. She looked at him. Her eyes were very dark, and there were shadows under them that had nothing to do with the hour. I should explain. You need to know why we... Later, he said. But the children are safe. The baby is warming up. Eat something and explain it to me in an hour when you're not about to fall over. She looked at him for another moment. Something moved across her face that he couldn't quite read. It wasn't gratitude, or not only that. It was something more complicated, like she was recalculating something she'd thought she understood. Then she picked up the bowl and ate. Ethan went back to the table and sat down with his cold coffee and pretended to look at the harness leather. Scout had settled back in front of the stove, now with Will curled up beside him. Thomas was the only one still awake besides Ethan and Clara, sitting against the wall with his knees drawn up, watching the room with those flat, careful eyes. Around 3 a.m, when the fire had settled into a steady rhythm and most of the room was asleep, Thomas said quietly, "She went to 7 houses." Ethan looked at him. "Before yours," Thomas said. 7 houses. Some of them didn't answer. One of them answered and then told her to leave. Mr. Foss, a pause, a slight tightening of the boy's jaw. He looked at her, and then he locked the door. Ethan said nothing. "I just thought you should know," Thomas said. "In case you're thinking about why she knocked on a stranger's door in the middle of the night. It wasn't her first choice. I know, Ethan said. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, the nod of someone who has decided to extend a provisional form of trust and is reserving the right to revise the decision. My father died in September, Thomas said. It came out flat, factual, the way children sometimes deliver the worst information, stripped of all the weight, because they haven't yet figured out where to put the weight, so they just set it down in the open and step back from it. We've been trying to manage since then. Mama's been working in town at the laundry, but they let her go last month. Said they didn't have work, but he stopped. Mrs. Foss told her she wasn't the right kind of woman to be working around decent people. The cold that moved through Ethan then had nothing to do with the temperature outside. I see, he said. Samuel got sick about a week ago. She's been trying to get the doctor to come, but Dr. Hale said he doesn't. Thomas stopped again, pressed his mouth together hard, the way his mother had. It was remarkable, the similarity. He doesn't make house calls for people who can't pay in advance. Ethan set down his coffee cup, very carefully, because he was aware that his hands had closed into something that was not quite a fist, and he did not want to knock the cup over. You can sleep, he said. Nobody is going to ask you to leave. Thomas looked at him. You're sure about that? It was not quite a question. I'm sure, Ethan said. Another pause, another measured look. Then Thomas unfolded himself from the wall, lay down on the floor with the kind of immediate surrender to sleep that only children and soldiers can manage, and was out before Ethan could count to 30. Ethan sat alone at the table in his suddenly altered cabin and looked at the room. Scout at the stove. Will curled against him. Nora against the wall. Thomas on the floor. Clara on the cot beside Samuel, her hand resting on the baby's chest. Her own eyes finally closed. He went back to the table. He picked up the harness leather. He started to work. By 4:30 in the morning, Samuel had stopped breathing with that rapid, shallow urgency and had settled into something slower and more deliberate. Clara woke at 5 without being called, checked the baby, and let out a breath that Ethan could hear from across the room. She sat up, smoothed her coat, and looked at him across the sleeping children. I need to explain, she started. Not yet, he said. Sleep a few more hours. We can talk when it's light. You don't even know who we are. I know enough. She looked at him steadily. How can you know enough? He picked up his cold coffee, looked at it, set it back down. Because Thomas told me how many doors he counted, Ethan said. And because Gerald Foss pulled his curtain, and because that's all I need to know right now about what kind of people you are. Clara Whitmore looked at him for a long moment across the dim, fire-lit room, and Ethan Callahan, who had not let himself be looked at with any real attention in 3 years, did not look away. Then she lay back down beside her son, pulled the blanket up, and closed her eyes. Ethan waited until her breathing steadied. Then he got up, put the last log on the fire, and went to the window. The sky was still completely dark. The storm was still running. Somewhere out in the pines, Bruiser was in the shed with enough hay to get through the night, and the chickens were huddled in their coop, and the world was the same world it had been 12 hours ago. But it didn't feel the same. He pressed his fingers against the cold glass and watched the snow come sideways across the yard and tried to remember the last time the cabin had made noise while he was in it. The specific noise of other people breathing, of a child shifting in sleep, of a dog's tail thumping once against the floor when someone moved past. He couldn't remember. That was the thing about silence. It was only comfortable until you remembered what the alternative sounded like. He stood at the window for a long time. The storm didn't ease. The dark didn't lift. He stood there anyway, listening to 6 people breathe in a cabin that had only been built for one, and he felt something he had almost entirely forgotten how to name. It felt like the particular weight of being needed. He had thought that weight would only ever feel like a burden, after everything. He had been wrong. He went and sat back down at his table, and he stayed there until the first gray light began to separate the sky from the ridge, and the children began to stir, and somewhere in the cot near the wall, the baby Samuel made a small, fretful, absolutely furious sound of displeasure. And Ethan Callahan, in spite of everything, almost smiled. The morning came in gray and reluctant, the way mornings do after a bad night, not so much arriving as accumulating, the darkness thinning by degrees until the shapes in the cabin became shapes again instead of shadows. Ethan had not slept. He was aware of this without feeling it yet, the way you're aware of a debt before you understand the interest. The body keeps a separate accounting, and it would present the bill later. For now, he was running on coffee and something harder to name. A low, sustained alertness that had less to do with caffeine than with the fact that his cabin, which had been a sealed and static thing for 3 years, was now full of breathing. Samuel woke first, which made sense. The baby had needs that operated on their own schedule and did not consult anyone else's convenience. He started with a thin, escalating whimper that built itself into a proper cry over the course of about 40 seconds. And Clara was upright and moving before the cry fully crested, pulling the baby against her shoulder with the automatic precision of a woman who had done this 10,000 times in the dark. Ethan watched her from the table without trying to disguise the fact that he was watching. She was checking Samuel the way you check something that frightened you badly the night before, hands moving quickly across his face, his neck, the back of his head, and whatever she found there made some of the rigidity leave her spine. "He's warmer," she said. Not to Ethan specifically, just to the room. "Good," Ethan said. She looked over at him. "Did you sleep?" "Some." She had the eyes of someone who could tell when a person was lying about sleep, but she let it go. She shifted Samuel to her other shoulder, patting his back in that slow, rhythmic way, and looked around the cabin with the morning light expression of someone seeing where they actually are after a night of crisis. The actual dimensions of the space, the actual inventory of what exists in it, the actual proportions of the problem. He watched her do the math. He had done it himself around 4 in the morning, and the numbers were not comfortable. "The children will need to eat," she said. "I know. I don't—" She stopped. Started again, differently. "I want to be clear with you about what I have. I have $17. I have the clothes we came in, which are not adequate for this weather. I have a pocket watch that was my husband's father's and is probably worth something. And I have—" She looked at the 4 children still asleep across his floor. "Them." Ethan got up and went to the shelf. "Breakfast first," he said. "Accounting later." "Mr. Callahan." "Ethan." A pause. "Ethan, I need you to understand that I'm not asking for charity. I'm not asking you to—" "I know what you're not asking for," he said, without turning around. "You made that clear when you stepped back from the door last night. So you can stop rehearsing that speech because I'm not interested in it." He reached for the flour tin. "How old is Thomas?" Another pause, shorter this time. 11. He'll be 12 in February. "He old enough to carry wood?" "He's been carrying wood since he was 8. "Good. Because I'm going to need help getting through the morning chores, and I'd rather put him to work than listen to you explain that you're not a burden. Breakfast will take about 20 minutes. The children can sleep until then." Clara Whitmore looked at the back of his head for a long moment. He could feel it the way you feel someone studying you from behind, a particular quality of attention that has weight. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He measured flour into the bowl. "Because it needed doing." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have right now," he said. "Ask me again in a week." She didn't push it. He appreciated that. Thomas woke 20 minutes later to the smell of cornbread, sat up from the floor with the careful, controlled movements of someone whose body hurt, but who was not going to mention it, and was on his feet and asking what needed doing before Ethan had finished the sentence explaining what there was to do. Ethan handed him a coat 3 sizes too large. It had been his neighbor Dan Pryor's, left behind 2 summers ago, and pointed him toward the woodpile. The boy went without complaint. That told Ethan something. Children who go to unfamiliar tasks without complaint have usually learned that complaint has costs. Will woke next, then Nora, and finally Lucy, who opened her eyes, looked at the ceiling for a moment with the absolute blankness of a 4-year-old assembling the previous night's information, and then immediately looked down at the oversized socks on her feet and stuck her legs straight out to examine them. "Those are mine," Ethan said. She looked at him. "They're big." "Yes." "My feet are in them." "They are." She considered this. "Okay," she said, apparently satisfied with the arrangement, and pulled herself up off the chair. Nora was the quiet one. She moved through the cabin carefully, staying close to walls and furniture, watching Ethan with the peripheral wariness of a child who has learned not to take up space in a new place until she understands the rules. She was 7, Clara had told him when the others were eating, and had always been like that, more observer than participant, storing things up. "She'll talk when she's ready," Clara said. She talked to her father every night. Since he died, she's mostly been... She stopped. Quieter. Will, by contrast, was 8 years old and appeared to have been constructed entirely of questions and motion. He had made his peace with Scout the night before and considered this a permanent arrangement. He spent the first half of breakfast with one hand on the dog's back and the other around his bowl, relaying to anyone who would listen the various things he had learned about Scout's personality in the past 7 hours. "He likes it if you scratch right here," Will said, demonstrating a spot behind Scout's left ear. Scout's eyes went half closed. "And he doesn't like loud noises, I think. When Thomas knocked over the chair, he lifted his head up like..." Will lifted his own head in an exaggerated startle. "Like that. And he sleeps on his left side mostly, but sometimes he switches." "Will," Clara said, "I'm just telling him. Eat. I'm eating and telling him. Then eat more and tell him less." Thomas came back in with 2 armloads of wood and stacked it beside the stove with practiced efficiency, then stood by the door brushing snow off his coat sleeve. "There's a lot of wood out there," he said to Ethan. "That your work?" "Most of it." Thomas nodded, doing the same quick inventory Ethan had seen Clara do that morning, assessing, calculating. "Your snares are probably buried," he said. "I saw where you'd set them, by the creek. The snow's drifted pretty deep on that side." Ethan looked at him. "You noticed the snares?" "I notice things," Thomas said, without any particular pride in it. "Just fact. I'll dig them out after breakfast." "I can help." Ethan looked at the boy for a moment. "You know how to reset a snare?" Thomas met his eyes. "My father taught me." "All right," Ethan said. "You can help." Something moved across Thomas's face that was not quite relief, more like a door opening in a room that had been shut for a while. The morning went the way first mornings do when a new arrangement hasn't settled into itself yet. Slightly too careful, people arranging around each other with more precision than was comfortable, everyone aware of the boundaries but not sure where exactly they fell. Ethan worked around the children the way you work around furniture you're not sure you own yet, carefully, but beginning to learn the geography. Clara cleaned the breakfast bowls without being asked, found where things were stored through the logic of the shelves rather than by asking, and put everything back in the right places. He noticed that. It was the behavior of someone who was trying to take up exactly the space they had been given and not an inch more, which he recognized as its own kind of precision. He went out with Thomas to dig out the snares. The cold had settled into a dense, still quality after the night's storm, the kind of cold that had exhausted itself and was now just sitting in the air like a fact. The snow was up past his knees in the drifts, and knee-high even in the open ground. Thomas walked behind him without talking, which Ethan appreciated, and when they reached the creek line, they worked in tandem, Ethan digging out the first 2 snares and resetting them while Thomas watched closely, then Thomas doing the third himself while Ethan watched. The boys' hands knew what they were doing. The movements were not identical to the way Ethan would have done it, but they were competent and deliberate and showed knowledge of the mechanics rather than just imitation of the surface. "Your father taught you well," Ethan said. Thomas was looking at the snare, not at Ethan. He was good at things like this, outside things. A pause. "He was a farmer mostly, but he knew the land." Ethan waited. "He died of a fever," Thomas said. "It came on fast. By the time we knew how bad it was... He made a small, tight movement with his shoulders that wasn't quite a shrug. "Mama tried to get Dr. Hale to come out. He came once, charged us 2 weeks' wages for the visit and said to keep him warm and hydrated and that there wasn't much else to do." Ethan watched the boy's profile. "There might have been something else to do," Thomas said quietly. "I don't know. I'm 11. But I've thought about it." They reset the remaining snares in silence. On the walk back through the dense cold and the ankle-deep snow, Thomas said, "Are you going to let us stay?" Ethan walked 3 steps before answering. "I haven't said otherwise." "That's not the same as yes." He was right. It wasn't. Ethan stopped at the tree line and looked back at the cabin, where smoke was coming from the chimney in a slow, steady column. Clara had put another log on, and said, "I don't know what the right thing is yet. I know what the wrong thing is. The wrong thing is putting you out in this before I've had time to think. So we'll start there." Thomas considered this with the gravity of someone who has learned that provisional answers are better than false certainty. "Okay," he said. They went inside. The problem, as Ethan laid it out for himself over the next several days, was not sentimental. Or it was not only sentimental, it was a practical problem with a practical structure. He had enough stores to last one man through a Montana winter that typically ran through March and occasionally through April. He had 6 people now. The math of that was not impossible, but it was thin, and the margin for error had collapsed to almost nothing. He needed more food. He needed more firewood than he had if the winter ran long. He needed his snares to work consistently, which they wouldn't. Nothing in Montana worked consistently. He needed to make a trip to Milner Creek, which he had been putting off because the road was bad, and he did not want to leave the cabin with Clara and the children alone in it. And then he corrected that thought. He did not want to leave them alone in it, and the fact that he was already thinking of it that way told him something he was not entirely ready to look at directly. Clara, for her part, was not idle. That was the first and perhaps most significant fact about her that the next several days revealed. She was not the kind of woman who treated crisis as a temporary inconvenience to be waited out. She treated it like weather, something you had to work around and with and against simultaneously, never quite winning, but never stopping. She found the loose hinge on the cabin door the second morning, dug through his toolbox without asking, and fixed it. Not perfectly. The pin sat slightly crooked in the bracket, but functionally, which was more than Ethan had managed in the 2 winters the hinge had been loose. "You didn't have to do that," he said when he saw it. "I know," she said. "The draft was coming in cold at the top." He looked at the hinge, then at her. "You know how to do that kind of work?" "My father was a builder. I learned what he'd teach me." Something slightly dry moved across her face. "He didn't teach me everything. He thought there were things a woman didn't need to know." "But you learned them anyway." "Some of them." She picked up the toolbox and put it back where she'd found it. "I'm better at some things than others." He discovered over the next few days which things. She was excellent at the interior management of the cabin, not just the cooking and the cleaning, which she handled with an efficiency that shamed the state of the place he'd been living in for 3 years, but the organization of it, the subtle restructuring of how things were arranged so that 6 people could move through a space built for one without constantly colliding. She was less good at ignoring her own discomfort, which she tried to hide and mostly succeeded, but not always. He caught her rubbing her hands together over the stove one afternoon, the careful wincing motion of someone whose knuckles were cracked and raw, and she stopped as soon as she noticed him watching. "I'm fine," she said. "I didn't say you weren't." "You were going to." "I was going to offer you the jar of tallow on the second shelf," he said. "It helps." A pause. A fractional softening around her eyes that she did not entirely permit. "Thank you," she said. He went back to what he was doing, but he was aware of her taking the jar and of the silence between them, which had started to have a different quality from the silence of the first few nights. Less careful. More like the silence between people who have started to understand how the other one fills it. The children were their own separate development. Will had essentially adopted Scout as a personal project, and Scout, who had spent the previous winter developing a philosophical acceptance of solitude, appeared to have recalculated his position on the value of company. He followed Will with a devotion that Ethan found both touching and slightly absurd. Lucy had decided that the oversized wool socks were hers now, and wore them every day, and he had not said otherwise. Nora remained quiet, watchful, present, but contained in herself. It was Nora who surprised him. On the 4th evening, he was sitting at the table working through the accounting of his stores, trying to come up with numbers that were more encouraging than they were. The lamp was low. Outside, the wind had picked up again, running a long, slow complaint along the eaves. Everyone else was asleep except for Nora, who was sitting near the stove with her knees pulled up and a piece of charcoal she'd found somewhere, making marks on the back of a strip of brown paper she'd salvaged from the supply shelf. He watched her without saying anything. The marks were not random. They had intention. She was drawing something, working it out carefully on the paper, erasing and redrawing with the stub of her thumb. After a while, she looked up and caught him watching. She did not look away. She held up the paper. It was the cabin, seen from outside with the snow around it and the chimney smoke drawn in careful spiraling lines. In the window, she had drawn 2 small shapes, figures, roughly sketched but unmistakable. One large, one small, sitting close together. He did not say anything for a moment. "That's very good," he said. Nora put the paper down on her knees and looked at it. Then she looked at him. "It feels safe," she said. It was the first full sentence he had heard her say. He had to look away, back at his accounting sheet, because something had happened to his vision that he was not prepared to discuss. "Good," he said. "It is." The trip to Milner Creek could not be put off past the end of the first week. He needed flour, salt, more dried beans, lamp oil, and if he could swing it, some kind of medicine for Samuel, who was better but still not entirely right, still running a faint fever that Clara tracked with her hand against his forehead every 2 hours with the regularity of a thing she had given herself no permission to stop doing. He told her he was going on the morning of the 8th day. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'll give you the watch. For the medicine." "We're not there yet." "Ethan." She said his name with a directness that stopped him. "Don't manage me. Tell me what we need and let me help provide it." He looked at her. She was standing at the window where he'd stood a week ago watching the storm, and the morning light was very flat and clear on her face, showing everything. The tiredness, the stubbornness, the particular kind of toughness that comes not from being hard, but from having bent a lot without breaking. "Not yet," he said. "Let me see what I can manage first." She did not look satisfied with this, but she let it go. He rode into Milner Creek in temperatures that were doing something theatrical with the wind, the kind of cold that found the gap between your collar and your jaw and used it. Bruiser was unhappy about the whole situation, but moved with the resigned competence of an old animal who had learned that unhappiness did not alter schedules. The town of Milner Creek in winter was a stripped-down version of itself. The false fronts of the storefronts looking more false than usual against the white of the snow. The street empty except for a horse tied at the rail outside the saloon and 2 women crossing quickly with their heads down. It had the quality of a place holding its breath. He tied Bruiser at the post outside Foss's general store. He stood for a moment looking at the door. Then he went inside. Gerald Foss was behind the counter, and his expression when he saw Ethan was the expression of a man who has done something he knows was seen and is trying to decide how to position it. He was in his 50s, red-faced in the cold weather way, with the careful prosperity of a man who'd built his store from nothing and was deeply aware of it. "Callahan," he said. "Foss." Ethan moved to the counter with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has decided what this conversation is going to be before it starts. "I need flour, salt, dried beans, lamp oil, and whatever you've got for infant fever." Foss's expression sharpened slightly. "Heard you took in that widow woman." "I need supplies," Ethan said. "People are talking about it." "I expect they are. Flour first." Foss did not move. He had the stillness of a man who has decided to make a point. "You know her situation," he said. "You know why she left the Harmon place. There's a reason people in this town have concerns." "She left the Harmon place," Ethan said, "because her husband died and his family took the farm and she had nowhere to go. That's not a situation. That's arithmetic." A pause. "And I know what you did," Ethan said, 8 nights ago. "I know she stood on your porch with a sick baby and 4 children in the cold, and I know you looked at her and locked your door." He put both hands on the counter. He was not angry, exactly. Anger implies heat, and what he was feeling was considerably colder than that. "I'm going to buy my supplies, and I'm going to go home, and I'm not going to say another word about it, but I want you to know that I know, and I want you to know that I'll remember it." Gerald Foss looked at him for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he went and got the flour. The medicine was the problem. Dr. Hale's office was on the far end of the main street, a narrow building that always smelled of chemicals and the specific variety of professional condescension that some doctors wear like a second coat. The man himself was in his 60s, small and precise, with the certainty of someone who has been the only doctor within 30 miles for long enough that the certainty has calcified. "Clara Whitmore's infant," Ethan said. Hale put down his pen. "I don't make house calls for—" "I know what you don't do," Ethan said. "I'm asking what the medicine is, not the call, just what you'd give a 3-month-old for a persistent fever." A pause. Hale studied him. "That depends on the cause." "It came on in the cold. He was warm for several days, then the fever dropped some, but hasn't gone all the way. He's eating, no rash." Hale was quiet for a moment, doing the calculation behind his eyes that doctors do when they're trying to decide how much information constitutes practice and how much constitutes courtesy. Willow bark tea, properly prepared, can be given in small amounts to an infant of that age, very diluted, a few drops at a time, not more, for the fever. Beyond that, warmth and nutrition and time are more effective than anything I have in this office. That's honest, Ethan said. It's the truth, Hale said. I'm not always wrong to ask for payment in advance, Callahan. I have a practice to run. And she has a sick child and no money, Ethan said. One of those things is a business problem. The other one is a child. He left before Hale could answer. On the way back through the main street, he passed the laundry where Clara had worked before she was let go, and the boarding house where someone had decided she wasn't the right kind of woman, and the church at the end of the block where the good people of Milner Creek assembled every Sunday to discuss, among other things, their obligations to their neighbors. He rode past all of it without stopping, and he let himself feel all of it, and then he filed it somewhere in the back of his mind and rode home. The sun was low by the time he got back, coming through the trees at that winter angle that makes the shadows very long and very blue. He could see the smoke from his chimney before he could see the cabin itself. When he came through the door, Will shouted his name with the complete sincerity of a child who had genuinely been wondering if he was coming back, and Scout made a sound that was not quite a bark, but wanted to be one. Clara looked up from the stove with an expression she got under control quickly, but not quite quickly enough. Relief, and something else. Something she was clearly not going to discuss. Thomas was at the table doing figures on a piece of paper, a task he'd apparently set for himself. Nora was drawing. Lucy was asleep in the chair with the wool socks. Ethan set the supplies on the shelf in order: flour, salt, beans, oil. Then he put the willow bark on the table near Clara without comment. She looked at it. How did you... Hale told me how to prepare it. Very diluted. Just a few drops. She picked it up and held it for a moment. Something moved across her face that she did not let become anything. Thank you, she said. It's willow bark, he said. Don't make it bigger than it is. I'm not, she said. But her voice had the particular quality of something being held carefully. He went to the window. Outside, the last light was going out of the sky, the blue shadows running long across the snow, and the temperature was already dropping back toward something serious. He turned around. Clara was preparing the willow bark at the stove, moving with the quiet precision she brought to everything. Thomas was doing his figures. Will had returned to Scout's left ear, explaining something to the dog in a tone of great earnestness. Nora looked up from her drawing long enough to show him, briefly, the page. Another sketch, the interior this time, everyone in it, the stove at the center. Lucy had shifted in her chair and one of the oversized socks had fallen half off her foot without waking her. He crossed to the chair, bent down, pulled the sock back up. He straightened, stood in the middle of his cabin for a moment. He thought about the word home, which was one he'd stopped using about 3 years ago because it had become too expensive, emotionally speaking. The cost of applying it to a place or a situation was too high when you understood how fast it could be taken back. He looked at the sock on Lucy's foot. He thought, well. He went and sat down at the table, picked up a pencil, looked at the blank paper in front of him, then looked at Thomas's figures beside him. What are you calculating? He asked. Thomas looked up. How many weeks of flour we have at current rate of use, and how much we'd have if we cut the bread portions by a quarter. Ethan looked at the numbers. They were right. You're good at arithmetic, he said. My mother taught me, Thomas said. She said it was the most honest language there is. Numbers don't tell you what you want to hear. Ethan looked at the numbers again. Then he took the pencil and added a line at the bottom. The snares, estimated per week, based on the past 3 winters. Add that in, he said. Thomas looked at the new line. Added it. That's better, he said. Some weeks it'll be more, some weeks less. Ethan set the pencil down. But it's a real number. Not a comfortable number, but real. Thomas nodded. He was quiet for a moment, then said, You went to see Foss. I bought supplies from him. Did you say anything to him? Ethan looked at the table. I said what needed saying. Thomas looked at his paper. Something around his eyes settled slightly. Not happiness exactly, not relief, but the specific easing that comes when someone has done the thing you were afraid they wouldn't do. Okay, he said. Clara put Samuel down in the cot, the baby finally properly asleep, his breathing slow and warm-sounding. She stood for a moment with her hand on his chest, counting, then came to the table and sat down across from Ethan. "How bad was it in town?" she said. He looked at her. She had the expression of someone who has spent a week bracing for a piece of information and is ready to receive it now. "Bad enough," he said. "Not as bad as it could be." "What does that mean?" "It means Foss sold me flour and didn't say more than he had to after the first minute. It means Hale is a careful man who is sometimes practical when he's pushed. It means the town knows you're here and they've got opinions, and those opinions don't concern me as much as our supply situation does." Clara looked at him steadily. "They'll make it harder. If you're seen to be—" she paused. "Associated with us." "Probably," he said. "That bothers you?" He picked up the pencil again, looked at Thomas's figures, put it down. "What bothers me," he said, choosing the words carefully, "is that a sick baby couldn't get medicine because his mother had the wrong amount of money. What bothers me is that a boy had to count 7 doors in the dark. What the town thinks about me specifically—" He shook his head. "I've had less than no interest in that for years." Clara was quiet. She looked at her hands on the table, then at the window, then back at him. "My husband's name was Robert," she said. It came out quietly, with the quality of something that had been carried for a while and was being set down carefully. "He was a good man. Not perfect, but good. He tried hard. He worked hard. He loved the children." A pause. "I miss him. I want to be honest with you about that because I think honesty matters more than it being comfortable." "I know," Ethan said. "My wife's name was Margaret," he said. And then, before he could stop himself or reconsider, "She used to tell me the east wall of this cabin was crooked. It wasn't, but I never told her that." Clara looked at him. Something crossed her face. Recognition, maybe, or the specific tenderness that comes from understanding exactly what someone means by something that sounds like a small story. "Why didn't you?" she asked. He looked at the table. "Because I liked watching her look at it." The fire settled in the stove. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound that was almost conversational. Samuel breathed slowly in his cot. Lucy's sock stayed on her foot. Clara did not say anything else, and neither did Ethan, and the silence between them was the most companionable thing that had lived in his cabin in a very long time. The notice arrived on a Tuesday. Ethan had not expected it, which was his own fault. He had been so concentrated on the immediate arithmetic of feeding 6 people through a Montana winter that he had let the larger arithmetic slip, the one that governed the land itself, the one with deadlines and legal language and a man's name at the bottom that he had been trying not to think about for the better part of 4 months. He found it tacked to his front door when he came in from checking the snares. A single folded sheet of paper, official cream stock, with the seal of Croft County at the top, and language that did not waste any warmth on the reader. He stood on the porch and read it twice in the flat morning cold, and both times it said the same thing. The note was from a land office clerk acting on behalf of Victor Blackwell, who held a promissory note against Ethan's property, a note Ethan had signed 3 years ago, in the weeks after Margaret and Daniel died, when he had not been thinking clearly about anything, and a man had come to the door with cash and a document, and Ethan had needed to not think clearly about money too, because there was only so much a person could hold at one time. The note was due in full in 31 days. The amount was $240. He did not have $240. He folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket and went inside. Clara was at the stove. She turned when he came in, registered something in his face, and waited. He put the paper on the table without saying anything. She wiped her hands on her apron, a piece of cloth she'd fashioned from the back of a flour sack, a detail he had noticed without commenting on, and picked it up. She read it the same way he had, once quickly, once slowly. "Victor Blackwell," she said. "You know him." It was not a question. The way she said the name had a particular texture to it. "He came to see Robert once, when we were still at the Harmon place." She set the paper down on the table carefully, as if it were something that might tear. "He had a way of looking at property that made you feel like he was already calculating what it would cost to own it." "What did he want with Robert?" "He wanted the south field. It ran along the creek, and he wanted the water access." She paused. "Robert said no. Blackwell said that was fine, very pleasant about it, but Robert told me afterward that he felt like the man had just written something down in a ledger somewhere and closed it." Ethan looked at the paper. He bought my debt 3 years ago from the bank that was holding it. I didn't know he'd bought it. I thought I was dealing with the territorial bank. Does it matter who holds it? Not legally. He pulled out the chair and sat down. His legs felt slightly unreliable, which was an unfamiliar sensation, and he did not like it. Practically it might. Blackwell doesn't want the money back. He wants the land. Clara sat down across from him. The children were outside. Thomas and Will running the snare line, Nora and Lucy in the yard where the snow had compacted enough to walk on. She had orchestrated that, he realized, given them tasks and reasons to be out of earshot. She had known, from the look on his face at the door, that what he was carrying was not for children. He was not sure when he had become the kind of man whose face was that readable. "How much do you have?" she asked. $60, maybe $70. Savings from the cattle sale in August. I was keeping it for spring, seed, equipment repairs, a new water line for the pasture. He rubbed the back of his neck, not close to 240. "I have 17, she said, "and the watch. Clara, don't." Her voice was level but had something behind it that wasn't. "Don't do the thing where you refuse the help and then sit with the problem alone. We've talked about this." They had not talked about it exactly, but they had circled it. The conversation about burdens and independence that kept resurfacing in different shapes, neither of them having it directly, because having it directly would require acknowledging things that were still forming, still not quite named. "The watch was your husband's family's," he said. "And this is your land," she said, "and 5 people are living on it, 6 counting Samuel." She put her hands flat on the table. "Robert would have understood that. I'm sure of it." Ethan looked at the paper. Thought about Blackwell. The type of him. The specific kind of patient, ledger-keeping hunger that Clara had described. The man who had looked at the south field and smiled when Robert said no and written something down somewhere and closed it. "Even with everything you have and everything I have," he said, "we're still 60, 70 short, minimum. Then we need to think about where the rest comes from." "There's nowhere left that it comes from. I can't borrow. My credit in Milner Creek is not what it was, for reasons you probably understand." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dan Pryor." He looked at her. "You mentioned him once. The coat that Thomas wears. You said it was a neighbor named Pryor who left it 2 summers ago. I didn't ask then, but Dan runs cattle about 6 miles east. We've known each other 20 years. Ethan thought about it. He's not a wealthy man. I'm not asking if he's wealthy. I'm asking if he's the kind of man who helps. Ethan thought about Dan Pryor. About 20 years of shared fence lines and borrowed tools, and the way Dan had shown up unannounced. The winter after Margaret died with a dressed elk carcass in his wagon bed, and had not said a single word about it, just helped Ethan hang it in the cold shed, and then stayed for coffee. "Yes," Ethan said, "he's that kind." "Then we start there," Clara said. "And we have 31 days. That's not nothing." He looked at her. She had the expression of someone who has been in worse positions than this, and survived them not through luck or rescue, but through the sustained application of clear thinking, and who is now bringing that same quality to bear on a problem that is not technically hers, except by the logic of the fact that she is in it. He thought, "I have been alone a long time." He thought, "I had forgotten this was possible." He said, "All right, we start there." The next morning he rode to Dan Pryor's. The road east was in better shape than the road to Milner Creek. It ran through a valley that caught less wind, and Bruiser moved with the slightly improved disposition of an animal going somewhere familiar. The Pryor place was visible from half a mile out, a low, substantial ranch house with smoke from 3 chimneys and a barn that had been added onto twice and showed it. Dan was in the yard when Ethan rode up, splitting wood with the methodical focus of a man who has decided that is what this morning is for. He was in his mid-50s, broad across the chest, with a face that had been outdoors in every kind of weather for decades and showed all of them simultaneously. He set down his axe when he saw Ethan, not with surprise exactly, but with the particular alertness of a man who does not receive midwinter visits without a reason. "Callahan," he said. "Dan." Ethan got down from Bruiser. "I need to talk to you." Dan looked at him for a moment. "Come inside," he said. "Ellen's got coffee." Ellen Pryor was Dan's wife of 30 years, a small woman with a direct manner and the organizational capacity of someone who had been running a working cattle ranch from the day she arrived on it at age 19. She poured coffee without asking and then went to the other room, which was her way of giving men room to talk. Not because she wasn't interested, but because she had learned that men talked faster when they thought no one was keeping track. Ethan told Dan everything. He did not abbreviate it or soften it or present it in any particular light. He described the night Clara had come, the children, Samuel's condition, the week since, the snares, the supply math, the trip to Milner Creek, Gerald Foss, and finally the paper he'd found on his door yesterday morning. He laid it out in the flat, unadorned way he'd learned to present information, the way that left no room for assumption and required the listener to deal with the facts as they were. Dan listened without interrupting. He held his coffee with both hands and watched the table and listened. When Ethan finished, there was a silence of about 15 seconds. "Victor Blackwell," Dan said. "You know him." "I know of him. He bought the Weston property 2 years ago, same way. Held the note and let it come due. Old man Weston didn't see it coming until it was 30 days out." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "He's been working east along the valley. Your land would give him water access on the north side of the ridge." Clara said he was interested in the Harmon Place's Southfield too. Water access there as well. "Man wants to control the water," Dan said. "That's not a new strategy, it's just usually slower." He was quiet for a moment. "How short are you?" 60 to 70, depending on what the watch is worth. Dan's expression did not change significantly, but something in it settled, the way a decision looks once it's been made. "I can do 50, he said. "No interest. Pay it back when you can." "If you can't," he shrugged. "We've been neighbors 20 years. Ethan looked at the table. Something in his chest did something he was not prepared for, a kind of pressure that was not pain but was adjacent to it. "Dan," "Save it," Dan said. "We need to talk about the other 10 to 20. "I don't have other options." "You might." Dan got up and went to the door to the other room. "Ellen," he said. Ellen came back as if she had been standing 6 inches from the door, which she almost certainly had. She sat down at the table, folded her hands, and looked at Ethan with the clear-eyed attention of someone who has already been briefed through the wall. "The Hendersons," she said to Dan. "I was thinking the Hendersons," Dan said. "The Hendersons and possibly Frank Alcott. Alcott might be a harder sell." "Alcott doesn't like Blackwell," Ellen said, with the certainty of someone who has catalogued a town's grudges in precise detail. "He bought the note on the Alcott's cousin's land in Benton and foreclosed on it in '84. Frank's never forgiven it." Dan looked at Ethan. "There are people in this valley who have specific reasons to not want Victor Blackwell to own more of it. That's not charity, it's practical interest. If we put it to them that way, I'm not asking other men to pay my debts," Ethan said. "No," Ellen said crisply. "You're presenting them with the opportunity to prevent Blackwell from adding another property to his holdings before he controls enough water access to make life very difficult for everyone on this side of the ridge." She fixed him with a look that had no room in it for pride. "You can accept help for your own sake, or you can accept it for theirs. Either way, you accept it." Ethan looked at her. Dan was looking at him with the expression of a man who has been married to Ellen Pryor for 30 years and has therefore stopped being surprised by exactly this quality. "You've always been more direct than most people," Ethan said. "Someone has to be," Ellen said. She picked up his coffee cup and refilled it. "How is the widow?" The shift was so quick he almost didn't register it. He stopped. "Her name is Clara." "How is Clara?" He looked at his refilled cup. "She fixed the hinge on my front door," he said. "The one that's been loose since 2015. Something moved across Ellen's face that was not quite a smile. "Is that so?" "And she reorganized the supply shelf so that 6 people can use a cabin built for one without things constantly running out in the wrong order." "Practical woman," Ellen said. "Very." A pause. Dan was looking at the window with an expression of studied neutrality that Ethan recognized as a man working hard not to contribute to a conversation he was enjoying. "I should get back," Ethan said. "Leave me the notice," Ellen said. "The legal one. I want to look at the language." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because I read carefully and you're angry, and angry men don't read carefully." She held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment, then took the paper from his coat and gave it to her. She unfolded it and began reading it at the table with the focus of someone entirely comfortable letting other people wait. After about 2 minutes, she said, "The notice was filed on the 14th. The 31 days runs from the 14th, not from when you received it." Ethan went very still. "Someone tacked it to your door recently," Ellen continued, "but the clock started running 12 days ago." The silence that followed was of a particular quality. "That means I have 19 days," Ethan said, "not 31. 19 days, Ellen confirmed. She folded the paper and set it on the table. "Which means we need to move faster than I'd planned, but it's still manageable." She looked at Ethan with the steadiness of someone who has decided to treat this as a logistics problem and will not be diverted from that framing. "I'll go to the Hendersons today. Dan will ride to Alcott's. You go home and get your numbers exactly what you need, not approximately. And tell Clara that the watch question may not come up." He rode home faster than he'd come. He did not let himself think too precisely about the feeling that was accompanying him. The warmth of it, the unfamiliar and faintly destabilizing warmth of having people apply themselves to his problem with the same focused energy that Ellen Pryor brought to everything she decided mattered. He had been alone so long that help, real help, had started to feel like something from a different language, something he'd once been fluent in and had let go. When he got back to the cabin, Clara was outside with Nora, the two of them at the woodpile. Clara was splitting and Nora was stacking, and they were talking in the quiet way they'd developed. Clara saying something low, Nora responding in the brief, careful way she had, neither of them requiring the other to be different from what they were. Clara looked up when he rode in. He got down, walked Bruiser to the shed, and when he came back she was waiting by the door, axe handle in both hands, reading him the way she'd gotten good at reading him over the past weeks. "Dan Pryor," he said, $50. No interest. She exhaled slowly through her nose. "Ellen Pryor is working on more," he said. "She thinks there are other men in the valley with reasons to keep Blackwell from getting the property." Clara was quiet for a moment. "And the watch?" "Hold on to it for now." She looked at him steadily. "You let people help you." "I'm trying to learn." Something moved through her eyes that she did not organize into an expression. "Robert had that problem too," she said, "carrying everything alone. I spent 7 years trying to convince him that I was a partner, not a dependent." She looked at the axe handle in her hands. "He got better at it, near the end." "I'm starting later than he did," Ethan said. "You're starting," she said. "That's the part that matters." They went inside. That evening, after the children were settled, Clara brought out the watch. She set it on the table between them. It was a good watch, a Waltham, gold-filled case, with an engraving on the back that Ethan could see was worn soft by handling, but had once been a name or a phrase. "Robert's grandfather carried it through the war," she said. "Came home with it when a lot of other things didn't come home." She turned it once on the table. "I've been holding it since Robert died because it felt like the last solid thing from before all of this." She looked at it. "But I'm done letting before be more important than now." Ethan looked at the watch and did not touch it. "We may not need it," he said. "I know, but I wanted you to know it was there and that I'm not holding it back." She looked up at him. "No more holding things back." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "Margaret used to do all the accounts. I let her because she was better at it and because it made her feel like the ranch was as much hers as mine." He paused. "After she died, I did the accounts myself and made every decision myself, and I thought that was what carrying on meant, being sufficient, not needing anything." "Did it help?" "It kept me moving. That's not the same thing." Clara looked at the table. "No," she said. "It's not." The knock came on the 14th day. Not a desperate knock like the first one, a deliberate one. 3 measured blows of a man's knuckle who is accustomed to doors opening for him. Ethan was at the table when he heard it, and something in the quality of it told him, before he'd crossed the room, who it was going to be. Victor Blackwell was a tall man, somewhere in his mid-60s, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had aged into something that just looked expensive. He wore a coat that was too fine for a ranch call, which was deliberate. He had a younger man with him, a few steps back, whose function was not immediately clear but who had the alert stillness of someone employed to be present. "Callahan," Blackwell said. His voice was the voice of a man who spent a lot of time being very reasonable. "Blackwell." Ethan stood in the doorway, not stepping back. Blackwell's eyes moved briefly past him, taking in the interior of the cabin, the evidence of more people than one man required, the children's things visible on the shelf near the door. His expression did not change, but something behind it filed the information. "I heard you'd had some company," Blackwell said. "Hard winter for some folks." "It is," Ethan said. "I wanted to come by in person. I think these things are better handled in person, don't you? The notice is just formality. I want you to know I have no interest in making this difficult." "What do you want, Mr. Blackwell?" A small pause. The half-second pause of a man who is accustomed to controlling the pace of conversations and who has registered that this one is moving slightly faster than he'd planned. "I want to offer you a fair price for the property," Blackwell said, "above what the debt would cost you. It's a reasonable offer, and I think you know the math better than most men. You've been a careful rancher, I'll say that." "I'm paying the note," Ethan said. "You're short by a significant amount." "I'm aware of what I'm short by." Blackwell's expression did not harden so much as clarify. Something patient and specifically calculating moved behind his eyes. "I know about Dan Pryor," he said. "I know he offered you 50. I know you don't have the rest." He tilted his head slightly. "I'm not here to embarrass you, Callahan. I'm here to offer you a clean exit from a situation that's become more complicated than you planned for." "It hasn't become more complicated," Ethan said. "It's become more full." Blackwell looked at him for a moment. Then his eyes moved past Ethan again, deliberately this time, landing on Clara, who had come from the back of the cabin and was standing behind Ethan with the quiet, absolute stillness of a woman who is listening to something and has decided that her presence is itself a statement. "Mrs. Whitmore," Blackwell said. His tone shifted by a fraction. Not quite warmer, but different, more layered. "I knew your husband. A capable man. I was sorry to hear about his passing." "I believe you were sorry about the South Field," Clara said. The silence that followed had weight. Blackwell looked at her for a moment with an expression that did not change at its surface. Then he looked back at Ethan. "5 days," he said. "If you come to me in 5 days with a reasonable conversation about options, I'll extend the note another 30 days on top of what remains. That's generous." "I don't need 30 more days," Ethan said. "I need 5. Blackwell looked at him steadily. "You have 5 days remaining on the original notice." "I know," Ethan said. Something moved in Blackwell's expression. The first genuine movement, a slight recalculation. He had expected a man who was further into panic than this. He had come prepared for panic. "You're more confident than the math suggests you should be," he said. "I learned that from a woman who walked 7 miles through a blizzard with 5 children and a sick baby," Ethan said. "Confidence doesn't require comfortable numbers, just real ones." Blackwell looked at him for another moment. He looked at Clara. He looked at the cabin. The chimney smoke, the patched door, the wood stacked efficiently against the wall. "I'll see you in 5 days," he said. It was not a question. "You'll hear from my attorney," Ethan said. Blackwell's eyes returned to him sharply. "You don't have an attorney." "I have a neighbor who knows how to read legal notices and knows which county clerk to talk to," Ethan said. "That's close enough." Blackwell studied him. Then he turned and walked back to his horse, his companion following. He mounted, looked back at the cabin once, and rode. Ethan stood in the doorway until the sound of the horses was gone. Then Clara's hand touched his arm, just briefly, just the weight of it. He did not turn around. "What county clerk?" she said. "I don't know yet," he said, "but Ellen Pryor will." He heard her breath, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, something that lived between relief and a kind of fierce determination that was becoming familiar to him. He turned around. She was standing 3 feet away with her hands at her sides and her jaw set, and her eyes were very bright, and she said, "Tell me what I can do." "Write down everything you know about Blackwell," he said. "The Southfield conversation with Robert, anything Robert told you afterward, any names he mentioned in connection with Blackwell. Everything." "All of it?" "All of it. Ellen will know what matters." She nodded and went to find paper. He watched her go. Thomas had materialized at his elbow at some point during the exchange. The boy moved quietly enough that he was simply present without a rival. He was looking at the road where Blackwell had been. "That's the man who wants the land," Thomas said. "Yes." "He was polite about it." "He's always polite about it," Ethan said. "That's what makes him effective." Thomas considered this. "Are we going to lose it?" Ethan looked at the road, then at the cabin. the smoke from the chimney, the patched hinge on the door. The oversized socks Lucy had left by the step, which she'd taken off to run in the yard and not yet retrieved. No, he said. He said it the way Clara had said things to him in the first few days, not with comfortable certainty, but with the flat commitment of someone who has decided that the outcome is not negotiable and is now simply working out the steps. Thomas looked at him with those flat, careful eyes. Okay, he said. Inside, Clara was already writing. Her handwriting was quick and dense, the handwriting of a woman who thinks faster than the pen moves, and she was going back to fill in gaps between sentences, adding details in the margins with small arrows pointing to where they belonged. Ethan watched her from across the room for a moment. The focused tilt of her head, the way she pressed her lips together slightly when she was deciding how to say something, the absolute concentration. He thought about what she'd said about Robert, about being a partner, not a dependent, about 7 years of trying to convince him. He thought about Ellen Pryor going to the Hendersons, Dan writing to Frank Alcott, the amount of motion that was happening on his behalf right now across 6 miles of Montana winter. He had spent 3 years making himself smaller and more self-contained, building a life that required nothing from anyone, and he had called it surviving. He had thought that was the best version of what he could manage, that it was a kind of dignity. He watched Clara write, and he thought that maybe dignity wasn't about requiring nothing. Maybe it was about being worth the trouble. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. What did Robert say exactly? About the way Blackwell looked at the field. She did not look up. He said it was the look of a man who was adding, not appraising, like he wasn't asking what it was worth. He was adding it to something that already existed in his head. Does he have land on the east side of the ridge? I don't know. Robert thought he might. There was a property. The old marsh claim, I think Robert called it. Ethan went still. The marsh claim is waterlocked on 3 sides, he said slowly. The only access to the eastern creek run from that property is through. He stopped. Clara had stopped writing. She was looking at him. Through your land, she said. Through my land, he said. The north pasture runs right along it. They looked at each other across the table. He doesn't want the land, Clara said. He wants the corridor. He's been building toward it for 2 years, Ethan said. The Weston property, trying for the Harmon South Field. Now this. He put his hand flat on the table. If he owns this land, he owns the only viable route to get water from the eastern creek onto the marsh claim. He can develop the marsh claim. He can run cattle on it. Without this corridor, the marsh claim is landlocked from its own water. Can we prove he owns the marsh claim? Land records are public. Ellen will know how to get them. He was already on his feet. This changes the conversation. He's not just a man who wants to add a ranch. He needs this specific piece of land for something specific. Which means he needs it more than he's let on, Clara said. Which means we have more leverage than we thought. Clara looked at the paper in front of her. Then she put the pen down and looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her before. Not relief, not hope exactly, but the precise, bright focus of someone who has just seen the shape of a problem shift from impossible to difficult, and who understands that difficult is an entirely different country. Go to Ellen, she said. Tonight if you can. Tonight, he agreed. He was putting on his coat when Lucy appeared from the back room dragging her wool socks by one cuff, looked at the general activity in the cabin and said, with the placid curiosity of a 4-year-old, "Are we in trouble?" Ethan crouched down to her level. He pulled the sock from her hand and began working it onto her right foot. "Not anymore," he said. Lucy examined his face with the direct, uncomplicated attention she brought to everything. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied, and stuck out her other foot. He put the second sock on, stood up, looked at Clara. She was already holding the pages she'd written, folded, ready for him to take. He took them. Their fingers didn't quite touch in the exchange, and then they did, briefly, and neither of them addressed it. He went out into the cold Montana evening with Clara's handwriting in his coat pocket and the specific feeling of a man who has stopped fighting alone and has not yet fully learned what fighting together feels like, but is beginning, with some urgency and considerable gratitude, to find out. Ellen Pryor had been awake when he arrived. That was the first thing. The lamp still lit in the kitchen window at 9 in the evening, which meant either she'd been expecting him or she simply kept the hours of a woman who had too much to think about to surrender to sleep at a reasonable time. He suspected both were true simultaneously. She opened the door before he knocked, which confirmed it. "Come in," she said. "Dan's already gone to bed, but I'll wake him if we need him." "We might need him," Ethan said. She looked at his face, then at the folded pages he was holding. "Sit down," she said. "I'll get coffee." He told her about the Marsh claim while she poured. He watched her face as he laid it out, the corridor, the water access, the 2-year pattern of acquisition that suddenly made sense as a single strategy rather than a collection of unrelated purchases. Ellen Pryor's face when she was thinking was a remarkable instrument. It did not show thought so much as it showed the absence of everything that wasn't thought. Every other expression cleared away to make room. When he finished, she was quiet for about 30 seconds. Then she unfolded Claire's pages and read them. She read slowly, which surprised him. He had expected the speed she brought to most things. But she went through Claire's handwriting with the careful attention of someone extracting specific information from a document rather than reading for narrative, and when she finished, she turned back twice to check things. "Robert Whitmore was perceptive," she said. "He described the way Blackwell looked at the field. He described it exactly right." She set the pages down. "The Marsh claim. I know the property. Old Silas Marsh died in '79, and his son tried to run cattle on it for 2 years but couldn't make it work without reliable water access. It's been sitting unused since '81. She tapped the table once with one finger. "If Blackwell owns it and gets access through your north pasture, he can run 300 head on that land, probably more. He's got the capital to develop it properly." "What's it worth to him?" Ethan said. Ellen thought. At current cattle prices, with full water access and development, over 10 years? She looked at the ceiling briefly. $15,000–$20,000 in cattle revenue. Minimum. The number sat between them for a moment. "He's offering to buy my land to satisfy a $240 note," Ethan said. "He's offering to buy a $20,000 key for $240, Ellen said. "And he's been very patient about it." She picked up her coffee. "The question is whether we can use what you know to negotiate something, or whether we go a different direction entirely." "What's the different direction?" She looked at him. "You pay the note. In full. In 4 days." "Ellen, I went to the Hendersons today," she said. "Carl Henderson has $20 and personal reasons to dislike seeing Blackwell accumulate land in this valley. His wife Agnes has 15 she manages separately, and the same reasons." She held up a hand before he could speak. "Dan is writing to Frank Alcott's tomorrow morning first thing. Frank's feelings about Blackwell and the Benton property foreclosure are exactly what I told you they were. I expect Frank can do 25, maybe 30. Ethan was doing the arithmetic. "That's still short." "By how much?" He counted. "Dan's 50. The Hendersons 35. Alcott's estimated 25 to 30. His own 60 to 70. Clara's 17. 10 to 20, depending." "I have it," Ellen said. He looked at her. "Don't," she said before he could begin. "Don't do the thing. I have it. I can spare it. And I have my own reasons for not wanting Victor Blackwell to own the North Ridge Water Corridor. My reasons are not your business, and you don't need to thank me for them." She met his eyes steadily. "What you need to do is get to the county clerk's office in Hargrove on day 4, not day 5, day 4, and pay the note in full with proper documentation so that Blackwell cannot claim procedural error or contest the payment on a technicality." "Hargrove is 40 miles, Ethan said. "It is." "In current road conditions, on a good horse, that's a full day of riding." "It is," she said again. He thought about Bruiser, who was a reliable animal but not a fast one and was 12 years old. He thought about the road to Hargrove, which ran through 2 mountain passes that would be carrying the weight of the full winter snowpack right now. "I'll need to leave on day 3, he said, "before dawn." "Yes." Ellen refilled her own coffee and did not refill his, which was her way of indicating that the productive part of the evening was nearing its end. "And you need to tell Clara where you're going and why, and what it will mean when you come back." He looked at her. "What it will mean." "Ethan," her voice was not unkind, "you have been living like a man who is waiting for something to justify not being alone anymore, and that something arrived on your porch 8 weeks ago in a snowstorm. I'm telling you this not because it's my business, although I've decided it is, but because you are going to ride 40 miles through a Montana pass in February to pay a debt so that 5 people have somewhere to live. And when you come back from that, Things will be different whether you acknowledge them or not. You should decide before you go, not after. The silence in the kitchen was very particular. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved once across the yard and went still. She lost her husband 4 months ago, Ethan said. I know that. It's not... He stopped. It would be too fast. For her. That's her decision, Ellen said. Not yours to make on her behalf. She looked at him with the level, undeflectable gaze she brought to most things. You're not protecting her by keeping your own counsel. You're just keeping your own counsel. He rode home under stars that were very bright and very cold, the kind of sky that only appears in deep winter when the air has been wrung completely dry of moisture and everything overhead is just light, absolute and indifferent. Bruiser moved beneath him with the steady, unhurried competence of an old horse that knows its own road, and Ethan sat and let the cold work on him and tried to organize his thinking into something useful. He was not a man who had ever been particularly good at the interior work. Margaret had teased him about it, gently, but consistently, the way you tease someone about something that is genuinely true. She had said he processed things through his hands, that she could always tell what he was feeling by what he went and fixed or built or repaired. That the winter after his father died, he had re-roofed the barn entirely, and the winter after the failed cattle deal of 1881, he had rebuilt the fence line on the north pasture from scratch, and both times he had emerged from the physical work somehow resolved without having discussed anything. He thought about that now. He thought about what it said about him, and whether it had made things harder for her, being married to a man who metabolized feeling through labor. I thought he should have asked her that, and hadn't, and couldn't now. He thought about what Ellen had said, that Clara's decision was Clara's to make. He thought about their fingers touching briefly over the folded pages. Bruiser turned into the lane without being directed. The cabin came into view with the lamp still lit in the window, and something in Ethan's chest performed its recent habitual movement. That shift, that settling, the feeling of a compass needle finding its direction after a long period of drift. Clara was awake. She was sitting at the table when he came in, with a cup of something warm and Thomas's arithmetic paper in front of her, though she had not been looking at it. She had been looking at the door, which meant she had been listening for him. She did not make anything of that. Ellen, she said, she's moving on the money. She thinks we can be at the full amount by day 3, if Alcott comes through. He hung his coat and sat down across from her. I need to ride to Hargrove on day 3, 40 miles. Pay the note at the county clerk's office directly. Clara absorbed this. That's a full day's ride. In good conditions. The passes are going to be bad. Take Bruiser? He's what I have. She was quiet for a moment. She turned the cup in her hands. And if something goes wrong on the road? It won't. Ethan. Her voice had the same quality it had when she said his name in the mornings. Matter of fact, but with something underneath it that she did not dress up. If something goes wrong on the road, we lose the land anyway, and you're 40 miles from here in the middle of February. I know the road. I know you do. She looked at the table. I'm not trying to talk you out of it. I need to know you understand that it matters. That you coming back matters. Not just the note. He looked at her across the table in the low lamplight. There was a version of himself that would have deflected this, that would have made it practical, said something about the children needing the land, about the winter supplies, about the logical chain of necessity. That version of himself had been the primary version for 3 years. He knew it very well. He knew exactly how it worked and what it cost. I understand, he said. I'm coming back. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and picked up her cup. Tell me about the Marsh claim, she said. Everything, he told her. All of it. The corridor, the water access, Ellen's estimate of what it was worth to Blackwell over 10 years, the 2-year pattern of acquisitions. As he laid it out, he watched the expression on her face move from attention to recognition to something hard and specific. He came to the house, she said when he finished. Ethan waited. 6 months before Robert died, he came in the evening, which I thought was strange for a business call. Robert met him outside and I watched from the window. She stopped. He wasn't looking at the south field. I thought he was. I told Robert afterward that I'd seen him looking at the field. But he wasn't. He was looking north, toward the ridge. She set her cup down. He was looking toward your land. The lamp flame moved in some unfelt draft. He knew Robert was sick, Ethan said slowly. He knew before we did how sick, Clara said, or he found out quickly. He came back twice more after Robert died, to offer condolences. Very proper. Her jaw was set in a way he recognized now, the expression she wore when she was angry and had decided to be useful about it instead of just angry. He wasn't offering condolences. He was assessing the timeline. Clara, he knew I wouldn't be able to hold the property without Robert. He knew the family would take it back. He knew I'd end up in town with nothing, and that eventually someone would have to deal with him about that north corridor, and he'd have the patience to wait until whoever that was had run out of options. She looked at Ethan with very bright, very steady eyes. He's been planning this since before Robert died. That's not something we can prove, Ethan said carefully. No, she said. But it's something we know. And knowing it means we know what kind of man he is, which means we know he'll try something in the next 4 days. He won't just wait for the deadline. Ethan thought about that. What would he try? He'd try to make it harder for you to get the money, or harder for you to get to Hargrove. She looked at the lamp. He knows about Dan Pryor. He said so. If he knows about Dan, he may know about the Hendersons. He might go to them. With what? A better offer? With pressure. He doesn't always need to offer more. Sometimes he just needs to make people feel that helping you has a cost. She looked at her hands. He did that in town. He didn't openly go against us. He just made it clear there was a cost to standing with a widow woman with nothing. People calculated. Ethan sat with that for a moment. It had the texture of truth, so not the dramatic truth of open villains, but the mundane truth of slow pressure applied in the right places by someone who understood how people calculated their own comfort. I'll talk to Dan in the morning, he said. Warn him. And the Hendersons. Someone should go to them. You could go, he said. Then, if you're willing... She looked at him. Me. You know what Blackwell is now. You know the Harmon property history, which is related. And you're... He chose the word persuasive. Something moved across her face. Carl Henderson doesn't know me. Ellen Pryor will go with you if I ask her. A pause. Clara looked at the table, then out the window at the dark, then back at him. He could see her calculating. The same process he'd watched her apply to every problem since the first morning. The quick, unflinching arithmetic of what was possible and what it would cost. All right, she said. All right, he said. They sat for another moment in the particular quiet that had become theirs. Not comfortable exactly, because there was too much in it for comfort, but honest. The kind of quiet that has weight and texture and asks nothing of you except to stay in it. I need to tell you something, Ethan said. She looked at him. When I get back from Hargrove, he said. He stopped, tried the sentence again in his head. It was not a sentence that had a better version. It just had this version or silence. When I get back, I'd like to talk about what this is. What we're... He made a slight motion with his hand that was not eloquent but was honest. Building here. Clara was very still. Not because of the land, he said quickly. The land is separate. This isn't about the land or the practicality of it or the children needing. I'm not talking about any of that. I know what you're talking about, she said. He looked at her. I know, she said again, more quietly. I've known for a few weeks. She turned her cup once on the table. I've been trying to be careful with it, because of Robert, because 4 months is... She stopped. It's not that I don't... She stopped again. You don't have to say it tonight, Ethan said. I'm not asking for tonight. I'm asking for when I get back. She looked at him for a long moment. Come back first, she said. Come back and then we'll talk. I will. Ethan. She said it with a directness that made him sit still. I need you to actually come back. Not just try to come back, actually. I know, he said. I will. Day 3 came fast and cold. Dan arrived at dawn with $30 he hadn't mentioned when Ethan had warned him about Blackwell the morning before. He'd gone back to his own accounts after Ethan left and found more than he'd initially thought, which Ethan suspected was less about arithmetic and more about Dan Pryor's specific character. Clara and Ellen had ridden to the Hendersons the previous afternoon and come back with the full $35. Carl Henderson had added $5 without explanation, which Ellen said was because Clara had told him about Thomas counting the doors, and Carl Henderson had a son Thomas's age. Frank Alcott had sent $30 with Dan, along with a message that consisted of 2 words, "Get it." The total, spread across the table on the morning of day 3, was $247. 7 more than needed, which Ethan looked at for a moment and then put in a separate pocket in case of road expenses. Clara was up before him, which he hadn't expected. She had coffee on and his heaviest coat laid out. The buffalo coat he'd owned for 12 years and worn on every serious winter ride. And when he came in from checking Bruiser, she handed him the coffee without a word and watched him drink it. "I packed food," she said, "in the left saddlebag." "You didn't have to." "I know I didn't have to." She looked at him with the expression she reserved for sentences that did not require completion. He had learned to read it. "Thomas wants to say goodbye." Thomas was standing near the door with the careful uprightness of a boy who has decided to be steady because he has decided that being steady is what is called for. He had his hands in his pockets and his jaw set in the way that was his mother's jaw, unmistakably. "You know the road?" Thomas said. "I do." "First pass is the bad one," Thomas said. "North side of the grade holds ice under the snow. It looks solid, but it's not." Ethan looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Robert took us through there in October. He pointed it out." Thomas met his eyes. "Hug the rock face on the north side of the pass. The ice is in the center and the south edge." "I'll remember," Ethan said. Thomas nodded. Then he put out his hand. Ethan shook it. The hand was thin and cold and had a grip that meant what it was doing. "Come back," Thomas said. "I will," Ethan said. Will was still asleep. Nora appeared from the back room and looked at Ethan with her particular steady look and then held up the drawing she'd been working on. The cabin again, from the outside, but this time with a figure on horseback moving away from it and another figure in the doorway watching. She put it back down without explaining it. He understood it. Lucy appeared with her wool socks and held up her arms to be picked up, which he did, and she patted his face once with both palms in the examining way of a very young child and then said, "Okay," as if she had run a diagnostic and was satisfied with the results. He set her down. He turned to Clara. She was standing by the stove with her arms at her sides, and she looked at him the way she'd looked at him the night before across the table. Not performing calm, just having it, the hard-won kind that doesn't require an audience. "The money's in the inside pocket," she said. "The left one, against your chest. It's the warmest. Don't put it in the saddlebag." "I won't." "And stop before the first pass if the visibility drops. Don't push it." Clara. "I know." She looked at the floor briefly. "I know you know. I'm saying it anyway." He crossed to her, stopped 2 feet away, which was close enough that it was a choice, and she did not step back. 4 days, he said. 3 there, 1 back. "I'll count them," she said. He put his hat on and went out. The cold hit him with the specific quality of very early morning cold, denser than daytime cold with a texture to it, the air holding the accumulated weight of the overnight temperature like a stored thing. Bruiser was ready, blowing clouds of breath, unhappy but resigned. Ethan mounted, turned the horse, and looked back at the cabin. Clara was in the doorway. Thomas was behind her. The lamp behind them made them into shapes, outlined, and the chimney smoke went straight up in the still air. He raised one hand, Clara raised one back. He rode. The first pass came at mile 18, and it was exactly what he'd expected, and worse. The grade was steep, and the surface was exactly what Thomas had described, a skin of ice under an inch of new snow that looked solid and was not. He felt Bruiser's hooves searching twice on the ascent, the horse making the small tense adjustments of an animal that knows it is on unreliable ground. He moved them to the rock face on the north side of the grade, the way Thomas had said, and they went up slowly and Bruiser did not slip again, but it cost 45 minutes on the ascent and another 30 on the descent. And when they reached the valley on the other side, the afternoon light was already going amber and thin. He pushed through. The second pass was gentler, more wind than ice, the kind of wind that came in long sustained waves across an exposed grade, and tried to walk through the gap between a man's collar and jaw. He put his head down and Bruiser moved with the steady, durable pace of old horse doing familiar work, and they came over the top with 2 hours of light left. Hargrove was visible from the ridge, a cluster of buildings in the valley, larger than Milner Creek, with the particular density of a county seat. He rode down toward it, feeling every mile of the previous 8 hours in his spine and his hands, which had gone stiff inside his gloves, despite the buffalo coat. The county clerk's office was a stone building on the main street, and it was still lit inside. He tied Bruiser at the rail, went in, and the clerk, a young man with the startled expression of someone who does not receive visitors at this hour in this condition, looked up and registered the state of him. "I need to pay a promissory note," Ethan said. "Callahan property, Milner Creek. Note held by Victor Blackwell." The clerk blinked. "Sir, we close at—" "I know when you close," Ethan said. "I rode 40 miles today to get here before the deadline. I need the proper paperwork and a stamped receipt with today's date." He put the money on the counter. $240. "I'd like to count it out with you present." The clerk looked at the money, then at Ethan's face, then at the clock on the wall. Something in the clerk's expression settled into the particular look of a man who has decided that arguing about closing time with someone who has just ridden 40 miles through 2 mountain passes in February is not a battle worth engaging. "Let me get the ledger," the clerk said. They counted the money together, twice. The clerk found the note, recorded the payment against it, stamped the receipt with the official seal, wrote the date, wrote the time, and signed it. He made a copy. He handed Ethan the original. Ethan held the paper. He had been braced for something, some procedural snag, some clause, something that Blackwell had arranged. He had been braced for it the whole ride, the anticipation of it sitting in his chest alongside the cold. But the paper was correct, and the clerk was correct, and the debt was paid, and there was nothing else. "Thank you," Ethan said. He found a room at the only boarding house in Hargrove for 35 cents, which left him the $2.07 in change. He ate what Clara had packed, cold cornbread and dried beef, which he ate sitting on the edge of a narrow bed in a room that smelled of pine soap. And he sat for a while with the receipt in his hands. He thought about Clara in the doorway, the lamp behind her, her hand raised. He thought about Thomas. Come back. He thought about Nora's drawing, the figure on horseback moving away, the figure in the doorway watching. He thought about what it had meant to have those two shapes placed together on the page by a 7-year-old who didn't miss anything. He lay down in his coat, it was too cold to take it off, and was asleep in under 2 minutes, which was 40 miles and 2 passes, and the sustained effort of carrying the weight of an outcome through a day's hard riding does to a man. He woke before dawn and was on the road. The ride back was colder than the ride out. The overnight temperature had dropped and the morning had not yet softened it. But the sky was clear and the light came early, and Bruiser, going home, moved with a conviction he hadn't shown the previous day. The first pass was manageable in the morning light. He could see the ice this time, see the north face of the grade clearly, and pick the right line from a distance instead of feeling for it. They made better time. He was 8 miles out when the weather changed. It came from the northwest, which was where bad weather always came from in this country, and it came fast. The sky going from pale winter blue to a specific gray that had nothing tentative about it, and the wind shifting and picking up and coming in with the wet, committed quality of a storm that had been building for days and had finally arrived at its destination. He pushed Bruiser. The snow started at 6 miles out. Light at first, the kind that looks manageable, and then within 20 minutes, not light at all. Horizontal, driven, reducing visibility to 40 feet, and then 20, and then to the length of Bruiser's neck ahead of him. He knew this road. He had ridden it in winter for 12 years. He kept the horse moving and kept his head down, and he navigated by feel and memory and the subtle pressure of the grade under Bruiser's feet, the way the land's own shape told you where you were if you'd learned to read it with your body over years of riding. At 4 miles out, he could not see his own hand when he extended it to the side. He stopped Bruiser. The horse stood with its head down, breathing hard, snow loading onto its mane and back. Clara's voice, the night before. Stop before the first pass if the visibility drops. Don't push it. He thought about that. He thought about come back. Actually come back. He thought about the receipt in his inside coat pocket. Against his chest, the warmth of his own body keeping the paper safe. Then he thought about 4 children and a baby in a cabin 4 miles away, and a woman who had been counting. He put his head down and kept moving. He did not do it carelessly. He moved Bruiser slowly, feeling the road, taking the drifts carefully, stopping twice when the wind came in hard enough to make the horse uncertain, and waiting until it eased before moving again. He counted his sense of the distance, a mile, 2 miles, a mile more. And when he thought he was close, he listened through the wind for anything he recognized. He heard the pines. The specific sound of the lodge pines in wind was something he had known for 12 years, the long, multiple-note sound that was different from open wind. And it was different on his particular ridge because of the way the trees were spaced, and he knew that sound the way you know a voice you've listened to for a long time. He turned slightly north and kept moving, and 5 minutes later the cabin came through the white. First the dark shape of it, then the lit window, a single lamp, and then the door opening before he'd even reached the yard. Thomas came out first, running. Then Will. Then Clara, who stopped at the porch steps with one hand on the post and watched him come with an expression that was not relief. Relief was too simple, too complete. This was something more complicated and more real. The look of a person who has been maintaining the position of someone who is not afraid and can now, with the object of the fear safely in view, stop maintaining it. He got down from Bruiser. His legs were unreliable in a way he chose not to address in front of anyone. Thomas grabbed Bruiser's reins without being asked. He walked to the porch. Clara was still on the steps, and when he reached her, she put both hands on his face the way Lucy sometimes did, a gesture that was checking and holding at the same time. And she looked at him with those dark, steady eyes and said nothing at all. He put his cold hands over hers. "I paid it," he said. "It's done." She closed her eyes for just a moment, then opened them. "Come inside," she said. "You're half frozen." He followed her in. The cabin was warm. The stove was going strong. Samuel was on the blanket on the floor, on his stomach, attempting with great determination to push himself up on his arms, which was new. He had not done that before. Lucy immediately came to display her wool socks, which had acquired a small hole in the left heel since he'd left. Will began a detailed account of everything that had happened in 3 days, which was considerable. Nora came to stand near him without quite touching him, which was her way. Ethan sat down at the table and Clara put hot food in front of him. Real food, something with beans and salt pork, and the good heavy warmth of something that had been cooking a while. And he ate it while the children talked around him and Scout pressed against his leg under the table and the stove did its work. After a while, when Will had run down and the smaller children had drifted toward the blanket where Samuel was conducting his engineering project, Thomas sat down across from him and said, "The pass?" "Ice on the grade coming in," Ethan said. "Storm on the way back, but I know the road." Thomas nodded. Then he said, "Blackwell came yesterday." Ethan looked up. "Midday. Mama went out to meet him. I stayed near the door." Thomas's voice was level. "He said he'd heard you'd ridden to Hargrove, but that there was a procedural question about the payment method that the clerk might not have—" Thomas stopped. He used a lot of words. I think the words were meant to make her uncertain. "What did she say?" A corner of Thomas's mouth moved. "She said she appreciated his concern and that she had confidence in the county clerk's office and that she wished him a safe ride home." Ethan looked at the table. "He didn't look happy," Thomas said. "But he left." Clara came to the table and sat down with her own cup and looked at Ethan with the expression of someone who has handled a thing and is not going to make more of it than it was. "He'll know tomorrow," Ethan said, "when the clerk's records are updated and the notice goes out." "I know," she said. "He won't come back after that. There's nothing left for him to come back for." "I know that too." She looked at her cup, then at him. "You said when you got back we'd talk." The cabin had gotten quieter while they were sitting there, the children settling into their evening arrangements, Will with Scout, Lucy nodding off in her chair, Thomas doing figures again. Samuel had given up on engineering and was sleeping on his back on the blanket with the absolute bonelessness of a well-fed infant. "I did say that," Ethan said. She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside, the storm was still running, the wind moving through the pines in that long, multiple-note sound he had navigated by, and the lamp on the table made the room its own separate world from the dark and the cold outside it. "I don't know how to do this gracefully," he said. "I don't either," she said. "I don't think it has to be graceful." He thought about the east wall, about never correcting Margaret because he liked watching her look at it, about the particular cost of the things you don't say until you can't say them. "I would like you to stay," he said. "Not because of the children, not because of the winter, not because of any calculation, I would like you to stay because this, he gestured slightly at the room, at the space between them, at all of it, is the first time in 3 years that any of this has felt like it was supposed to be inhabited. Clara looked at him. She turned her cup once on the table. I came here to survive, she said. I knocked on your door because I had run out of every other option, and I needed my children to be alive in the morning. I know. And I need you to know that what I feel now is not gratitude. I want to be very clear about that. Her voice was steady, and her eyes were steadier. It is not gratitude, it is... She stopped. I don't have a clean word for it yet, but it is not gratitude. Okay, he said. I need more time, she said. Not forever, just more time. I have time, he said. I'm not going anywhere. Something shifted in her face, not a smile, but the thing that sometimes precedes one, the softening before. No, she said. You're not. Across the room, Lucy had slid fully asleep in the chair, one wool-socked foot dangling off the edge. The lamp flame moved in a breath from somewhere. The storm worked its way along the ridge, and the pines answered it in their particular register, and in the cabin with the stove and the sleeping children and the old dog and the woman across the table, Ethan Callahan sat with the receipt in his coat pocket and felt the specific, unfamiliar, not entirely comfortable sensation of a man who has stopped waiting for his life to begin again and understood, without quite knowing when it happened, that it already had. The notice of full payment reached Victor Blackwell on a Thursday. Ethan knew this because Dan Pryor rode over that afternoon to report that he'd seen Blackwell's man, the quiet one who had stood behind him on the porch, ride through Milner Creek at midday with the specific purposeful unhappiness of someone carrying news his employer was not going to receive well. Dan had watched him go with the satisfaction of a man who has placed a careful bet and seen it pay out. It's done, Dan said, standing in the yard with his hat in his hands. Legally, cleanly, on the record, there's nothing left for him to contest. Ethan nodded. He had known it intellectually since the ride back, since the moment the clerk had stamped the receipt, but hearing it said aloud by someone else in the daylight of his own yard made it land differently, more solid, more permanent. He'll be angry, Ethan said. He will, Dan agreed. Men like Blackwell don't lose patience. They lose patience only about once, and then they move on to the next thing, because they always have a next thing. He'll be gone from your particular life by spring. He looked at the cabin, at the smoke from the chimney, at the wood stacked along the wall. How are they? Good, Ethan said. And then, because it was Dan and because it was true, better than good. Dan put his hat back on. Ellen wants to know if Sunday works. Sunday for what? Dan gave him a look. Dinner. All of you. She's been planning it since the morning after you rode to Hargrove. I'd recommend not declining. He gathered his reins. She's made a decision about Clara. What decision? That she likes her, Dan said. Ellen doesn't make that decision quickly or reverse it often, so I'd treat it as the significant event it is. He turned his horse. Sunday, noon. He rode off through the thin February light, and Ethan stood in the yard for a moment after he left, looking at the land, the north pasture with its snow cover, the ridge beyond it, the tree line where the lodge pines held their particular posture against the winter sky. He had looked at this land for 12 years and taken it largely for granted, the way you take for granted anything that has always been there. Now he looked at it differently. Not with drama. He was not a dramatic man, but with the specific attention you bring to something you came close to losing. He went inside. Clara was at the table with Samuel in her lap, doing the things she did most afternoons now. Working through Thomas's arithmetic problems alongside him, not to check his answers, but because she had found, in the weeks of doing this, that it was the best time for Thomas to talk. The boy talked sideways into mathematics. He would be explaining his steps, and some other thing would come through, some thought that had been sitting in him, and Clara had learned to receive it without making it a larger thing than he'd intended. Today Thomas was saying, without looking up from his paper, Will says he wants to stay here forever. I know, Clara said. He told me. Do you think we will? Clara looked at him. What do you think? Thomas considered his paper. I think Ethan would let us. A pause. I think he wants us to. I think so too. Another pause. Is that what you want? Clara was quiet for a moment. Samuel reached up and grabbed her finger, which he had recently discovered was an available object, and had been exploiting this knowledge thoroughly. "It's what I'm thinking about," she said. "That's not the same as not wanting it." Thomas processed this with the deliberateness he brought to things that mattered. Then he went back to his arithmetic. Ethan had been standing in the doorway long enough to hear most of this. He did not announce himself immediately. He stood for a moment with the cold from outside still in his coat and watched the two of them at the table, Thomas's bent head, the pen moving, Clara and Samuel beside him, the lamp making them all the same warm color. And he thought about what you call a thing when it has already become the thing before you've named it. He came inside and shut the door. Clara looked up. Read him the way she always read him now, quickly, accurately, without making a production of the accuracy. "Dan?" she said. "It's confirmed. Blackwell knows." He hung his coat. "Ellen wants us Sunday for dinner." Something moved across Clara's face that was not quite a smile and was better than one. "I like Ellen," she said. "She likes you," he said. "Dan said so, which means Ellen told him to say so, which means she's decided." "Decided what?" "That you're worth her time." He sat down at the table. "That's not a small thing." Clara looked at him with those steady eyes. "No," she said. "I imagine it isn't." The days between that Thursday and Sunday had a different quality from the days before. Not easier exactly, but less compressed. The immediate pressure had lifted, and without it the shape of daily life became more visible. Not survival's reduced arithmetic, but something fuller, the texture of 6 people inhabiting a shared space and beginning cautiously to stop treating it as temporary. Small things changed. Will stopped asking, in the indirect way children ask things they're afraid of, whether they would have to leave when the snow melted. He simply stopped asking, which meant the question had answered itself to his satisfaction through some accumulation of evidence that Ethan was not aware of providing, but apparently had. Lucy commandeered a lower shelf near the stove for her wool socks and a small collection of objects she'd gathered. A smooth stone, a piece of quartz, one of Scout's old toys that the dog had lost interest in. She arranged and rearranged these items with the serious intentionality of a person establishing territory and did not explain her system to anyone. Nora started talking more. Not a transformation, she would never be Will, who treated silence as a waste of available sound, but a gradual, steady increase, like a valve being opened incrementally by someone who is testing the pressure. She talked mostly to Ethan, which surprised him at first, and then didn't. She asked him about the land, about the animals, about the specific mechanics of things, how the snares worked, why the pines grew in some places and not others, what made the creek freeze from the edges inward. She asked questions the way she drew, with precision and patience, building a picture through accumulated detail. He answered her carefully. He had discovered that careless answers bothered her, not in a wounded way, but in the way that imprecision bothers someone who is trying to construct an accurate map of something. So he was precise, and she received his precision with the quiet satisfaction of someone getting exactly what they needed. Thomas, in those days, became something that Ethan did not have a word for. Not a son. Too loaded, too fast, too disrespectful of Robert Whitmore's place in the boy's life. Not a helper, though he helped. Something more like a counterpart. They fell into a working rhythm that didn't require much discussion. A shared understanding of what needed doing and who was suited to what, developed over weeks of daily labor until it operated almost like habit. They checked the snares together most mornings. Thomas was developing his own sense of the land, his own reading of the snow and the animal signs, and the way the weather came off the ridge. And Ethan found himself paying attention to the boy's observations, the way you pay attention to someone whose judgment you have learned to take seriously. One morning, about a week after the payment, Thomas said, "My father would have liked you." They were at the creek, resetting a snare that something had sprung without getting caught. Ethan was crouched over the mechanism, working the trigger with his fingers in the cold. "What makes you say that?" Ethan said. "He liked quiet men who did things," Thomas said. "He didn't trust men who talked more than they worked." A pause. "He would have argued with you sometimes. He had opinions." "I have opinions," Ethan said. "I know, but yours mostly come out sideways. His came straight out the front." Thomas watched the snare. He and Mama argued sometimes. Not badly, just about things they both cared about. He looked at the tree line. I used to think arguing meant something was wrong. Now I think it meant they both thought the thing was worth arguing about. Ethan looked at the boy. I'm telling you that, Thomas said with a slight deliberateness that was unmistakably Clara's. So you know it's not. So you know that arguing isn't wrong, if it comes up. Ethan looked back at the snare. He worked the trigger once more until it seated correctly. He stood up. Thank you, he said. You're welcome, Thomas said, and went back to reading the snow for tracks, as if the conversation had been entirely unremarkable. Sunday came bright and cold and clear. The sky, the particular shade of winter blue that only appears when the temperature is low enough to have pressed all the moisture out of the air, and the seven of them, Ethan, Clara, the four children, and Samuel bundled into everything warm they could construct, rode and walked the 6 miles to the Pryor place in the clean light of a February morning that was almost gentle. Ellen Pryor had made enough food for 12 people, which was her standard approach to hospitality, a philosophy that held that scarcity at a table was a failure of welcome. She had also, Ethan noticed, arranged the table with the careful attention of someone who had thought about where people should sit relative to each other. Clara ended up across from Ellen, which was clearly intentional, and Ethan ended up next to Dan, which was where he always ended up. The children scattered into the warmth of the Pryor house with the ease of children who have been somewhere long enough to know where things are. Will found the Pryor's old hound, who was ancient and deaf, and received Will's attentions with the patience of a large animal that has made peace with children. Lucy immediately examined Ellen's rug collection with the focused interest of a textile curator. Nora went to the window and looked out at the Pryor land with her assessing look. Thomas sat at the table with the adults, which Ellen permitted without comment. He was 12 in 2 weeks, and he had the manner of someone who had been managing adult concerns for long enough that the transition was mostly formal. We want to thank you, Clara said after the first round of food had been passed. She said it simply and directly, the way she said most things. All of you. What you did? The money, the Hendersons, Frank Alcott, we know what it cost. It didn't cost what you think, Ellen said. Most of it was self-interest. Ellen, Dan said mildly. It's true, Ellen said. I don't want Victor Blackwell controlling water access on the North Ridge. That's a real thing that affects us. The money was partly generosity and partly practical investment in not having a neighbor we don't trust controlling something we depend on. She looked at Clara steadily. That doesn't make it less, but I want you to understand what you're part of here. You're not charity, you're community. Clara looked at her for a moment. Something moved through her eyes. I understand, she said, and I'm glad of it. Both parts. Ellen nodded, once, the nod of a woman who has said what she meant and received it correctly. So after dinner, Dan and Ethan stood outside in the cold yard with coffee going cold in their hands, the way they had stood in 100 yards over 20 years, the way that required no particular reason beyond the fact of being neighbors and understanding that sometimes conversation needed open sky around it. Blackwell's moving on, Dan said. I heard he's looking at land up near the Billings County line, farther north. Someone else's problem, Ethan said. For now. Dan looked at the ridge. Men like that don't stop. They just relocate. But they do relocate, which is something. Ethan looked at the ridge too. The north face of it was in shadow already, the February sun going low early, and the snow on the upper grade was the particular blue-white of late afternoon in winter. I'm going to ask her, Ethan said. Dan was quiet for a moment. When? Spring, when the ground thaws and the land is itself again. He looked at his cup. I think she needs the winter to be over. The winter was survival. Spring is something else. That's thoughtful, Dan said with no apparent irony. Ellen told me to be thoughtful. Ellen tells everyone to be thoughtful, Dan said. Most people don't listen. You apparently do, which she considers a point in your favor. Ethan looked at the ridge. She had a good marriage, he said. Clara, 12 years. Whatever Robert Whitmore's limitations were, he was a good man and she loved him, and she's still carrying that. He paused. I don't want to step over something that deserves to be walked around carefully. No, Dan said, but you also can't walk around it indefinitely. At some point, walking around it becomes its own kind of decision. Ethan considered this. Spring, he said again. Spring, Dan agreed. March came in with the specific mood of a season that has not yet decided to be itself. Cold still, but differently cold. The temperature doing things with light that February didn't do. The snow on the south-facing slopes beginning the slow retreat that revealed, an inch at a time, the brown grass and dark soil of the world that had been waiting underneath. The ranch did what ranches do in the approach of spring, produced a list of things that needed doing that was longer than the list of available hours. The fence line on the east side of the north pasture had taken damage from a tree that had come down in January. 3 sections needed replacement. The chicken coop had developed a structural complaint that Ethan had been managing with temporary measures since November. The cold shed needed cleaning out before the weather made it necessary to use the space differently. The irrigation line for the kitchen garden, which Clara had looked at in late February and pronounced ambitious but possible, needed to be extended 20 feet and resituated. None of this was unusual for a working ranch in March. What was unusual was how it got done. Thomas took the fence line with Ethan, the two of them working a section a day over the course of 10 days. Thomas learning to set posts with the patience of someone who understands that the learning is the point, not the speed. Clara took the chicken coop, which she approached with the thoroughness she brought to everything, enlisting Will as her assistant and spending 2 days making it more sound than it had been when Ethan built it 8 years ago, which she did not mention and he did not address, because some things are better received without commentary. Nora kept a record. This was her own initiative. She had found a blank notebook in the supply chest and had begun, with the precise small handwriting of a girl who had taught herself to write carefully because she valued accuracy, a daily account of the ranch's condition. Weather, temperature, the state of the snowpack, the first signs of thaw on the south slope, the date the creek showed open water at the center. She showed it to Ethan one evening without explanation, and he read it and said it was good and asked if he could add his own observations to it. And she considered this for a moment and then said yes, and the notebook became something they kept together, the handwriting alternating, her careful small script and his larger, less elegant one, building a record of a place coming back to life. Lucy found a mud puddle in the first week of March and considered it the most significant development of her year to that point. She returned to it daily to monitor its progress, reporting its dimensions to whoever was nearby with the statistical confidence of a very small scientist. Samuel, at 4.5 months, had opinions. Strong ones, delivered with impressive vocal commitment. He had learned that the world responded to his communications, and he was applying this knowledge with the enthusiasm of a new discovery. He had also learned to roll from his back to his stomach, which he accomplished every time without apparent understanding of how he'd done it, and then looked around with the expression of someone who has ended up somewhere and is not entirely sure how. Clara watched all of this, her children, the land, the man who moved through both with the careful, deliberate presence that was specific to him, and she thought about things she had not let herself think about directly since the first months after Robert died. She had loved Robert. That was not a complicated sentence, even if the truth inside it was. He had been her first life. The life she'd built from a certain set of beliefs about what a life was supposed to look like. A farmhouse, and a man, and children, and seasons, and work. He had been good and limited and stubborn and kind, and she had known him across 12 years in the way that makes a person into something more than themselves in your understanding of them, accumulated and irreplaceable. He was gone. That was also not complicated, even when it was unbearable. What she was discovering, in the incremental way of things that don't announce themselves, was that the love she'd had for Robert didn't leave a hole that needed filling. It left a shape, a capacity, a known territory. She understood now what she was capable of. She knew the dimensions of herself in that regard. And what she was beginning to understand, in the warming weeks of March, was that what she felt when she watched Ethan Callahan talk to her daughter about how ice forms on a creek, or when she heard him answer Thomas with the precise, respectful attention he brought to everything the boy said, or when he looked at her across the table in the lamplight with that particular look that he had never tried to make into something she wasn't ready for. What she felt was not a replacement for anything. It was its own thing. New territory with its own dimensions that she had not known she had. She thought, I did not come to this cabin to find a second life. She thought, but here it is. It was a Saturday in the 3rd week of March when the moment arrived. Not dramatically, the way most real things arrive, but in the middle of an ordinary sequence of events, without announcement or preparation. They were outside in the late afternoon, the two of them, doing the end-of-day check of the animals that had become their shared habit. The children were inside. The light was doing something specific to the ridge, the long gold light of a March afternoon that is almost warm, that promises warmth even though the air is still cold enough to see your breath. The snow on the north pasture was half gone, the south slope nearly clear, the brown of the returning land mixing with the white that remained. They had finished with the horses and were walking back toward the cabin when Clara stopped. He stopped beside her. She was looking at the ridge. He looked at it too. The light on the snow, the dark of the pines, the long shadow of the ridge itself beginning to extend across the valley. Beautiful, in the plain functional way that land is beautiful when it belongs to you and is still there. "I want to stay," Clara said. He waited. "Not because of the winter being over," she said. "Not because of the money or the land or the practical. I don't want you to think it's any of that." She turned and looked at him directly, and in the gold afternoon light her face had the quality it had when she was saying something she had spent time with, something she had turned over and examined before bringing out. "I want to stay because of you, specifically. And I need to say that plainly because I've been too careful about saying it plainly." He looked at her. "I know what I feel," she said. "I've known for a while. I was giving myself time to be sure that I knew the difference between being grateful and—" She paused. "This. And I'm sure." He said, "What's this?" "You know what this is," she said. "Don't make me define it while I'm already being braver than I'm comfortable being." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the ridge and the pines answered it, and the light continued its slow work on the snow. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that whatever you say, nothing changes. The children are staying, you're staying. That's already decided and it's not conditional on anything." She looked at him. "But I would like it," he said, "if you would marry me. When you're ready. On your own timeline, not mine. I'm not going anywhere and I'm not asking for an answer today." He looked at the ridge. "I just want you to know that's what I want. So you can think about it without wondering if I'm thinking about it." The silence that followed was the good kind. Not the silence of not knowing what to say, but the silence of two people standing inside something that has just been said and letting it settle, because it deserves to settle. "I'll think about it," Clara said. Then, "I don't think I'll need very long." He looked at her. Something moved across her face that was not quite the smile that followed it, but was what came before, the private movement behind the eyes before the face commits. "I'll let you know," she said. She told him 2 weeks later, on the first real morning of spring, when the frost was finally off the ground and the south pasture showed green at the roots of the brown grass, and the creek was running fully open from bank to bank, loud with snowmelt. She said yes over breakfast, without preamble, while Will was arguing with Thomas about the correct method for coiling rope, while Lucy was feeding Samuel mashed oats with the approximate accuracy of a 4-year-old, while Nora was writing in the notebook. She just said it. Set down her cup and said, "Yes." "My answer is yes." The table went quiet. Then Will said, "Yes to what?" Thomas said without looking up from his rope, "Think about it." Will thought about it. His face moved through several expressions. Then he said, with the enthusiasm of someone who has just identified the correct answer, "Oh." A pause. "Good." Lucy looked at Ethan, then at her mother, then at Ethan again. "Are you going to be our papa?" she said. Ethan looked at Clara. Clara looked at him with the expression she got when she was leaving something to him, deliberately, because she wanted to see how he handled it. He looked at Lucy. "I'd like to be," he said. "If that's all right with you." Lucy considered this with the gravity she brought to significant decisions. "You give good socks," she said. "I do," he said. "Okay," she said, and went back to Samuel's oats. Nora had stopped writing. She was looking at Ethan with those level, assessing eyes. Then she looked down at the notebook, opened to the current page, and wrote something. She turned it so he could see. She had written the date. And below it, first day of spring. Good news. Thomas met his eyes across the table. The boy's expression was the controlled, careful expression he wore when something mattered enough that he didn't trust himself to be uncontrolled about it. He nodded once. Ethan nodded back. They were married in May. Ellen Pryor organized it because that was what Ellen Pryor did with things she had decided mattered, and no one suggested otherwise. It was in the yard of the cabin because Clara wanted it to be in the place where everything had started. At the door, in the cold, with the land around them. The Pryors came. The Hendersons came. Frank Alcott came, which surprised Ethan and seemed to surprise Alcott himself slightly, as if he hadn't made the decision to come until he was already there. 3 other families from the valley came, people who had watched the winter's business from a distance and had formed their own conclusions about what kind of man Ethan Callahan was and what kind of woman Clara Whitmore was. Gerald Foss was not there. His absence was noticed by everyone and commented on by no one. Victor Blackwell was by then in negotiation for land near the Billings County line, as Dan had reported. He had written off the Callahan property with the efficiency of a man who does not permit himself extended mourning over closed ledgers. He would find another corridor elsewhere. He usually did. But he would not find this one. The ceremony was brief. Clara had wanted it brief, not because it wasn't serious, but because seriousness didn't require length, and because there were things she didn't know how to stand still for too long. They said what needed saying. They meant it. The children stood in a row, Thomas straight-backed and deliberate, Will barely containing his impulse to look around at everything, Nora drawing the scene quietly in her mind, Lucy in her best dress and her wool socks, Samuel on Ellen's hip regarding the proceedings with infant severity. Afterward, in the yard, with people eating and the May light coming through the new leaves of the cottonwood at the edge of the property, Frank Alcott appeared at Ethan's elbow and said, "She walked through a blizzard with 5 children and a sick baby and knocked on a stranger's door at 2 a.m. "She did," Ethan said. "And you opened it," Alcott said. "I did." Alcott looked at the yard, at the people, at Clara, across the space, talking to Ellen with the ease of 2 women who have decided to understand each other. "My cousin lost his land because nobody opened a door when they should have," Alcott said. "In Benton, 84. He picked up his cup. "I'm glad someone did." He moved away before Ethan could respond. Ethan stood in his yard on his wedding day in May and looked at the land and the people on it, and he thought about what it cost to open a door. Not the dramatic cost, not the sacrifice and the heroics that stories like to assign to things, but the real cost, the one that is mostly invisible, the cost of reconsidering what you can afford to lose, when you have spent years making yourself small enough that losing things won't break you. He had thought that was wisdom. He had thought surviving alone was the same thing as being sufficient. He had made a whole philosophy out of it, 3 years of a carefully sealed life, and it had kept him moving without ever bringing him back. What Clara had cost him was his certainty that he was better off alone. What the children had cost him was his certainty that he was done becoming anything new. What that first night, the knock, the door, the bare feet, and the wool socks had cost him was the story he'd been telling himself about what kind of man he was now, post-grief, post-loss, post-hope. It had been expensive. He had not gotten a moment of it back. Clara appeared at his side. She had a cup of something warm and she put it in his hand and stood beside him, not talking, because she understood that he was thinking and that she was part of what he was thinking about, and that this was not a moment that required words from her. After a while, she said, "What are you thinking about?" "The door," he said. She looked at him. "That night, when I opened it." He looked at the yard, at the people, at the ridge beyond the fence line. "I almost didn't." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "I saw it. In your face when you opened it, the half-second before you moved." She turned her cup in her hands. "I've thought about that, about what it would have meant if you'd stepped back instead." "We would have found somewhere," he said, because he needed to believe that. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe not. It was very cold, and I was nearly out." She looked at the ridge. "What I know is that I knocked on 8 doors that night, and you were the only one who opened. That's not nothing." "No," he said, "it's not. There is something particular about the way a life reconstitutes itself after it has been broken. It doesn't restore to its previous form. It can't. And trying to understand it that way leads to a specific and prolonged disappointment. What it does is become something new that carries the shape of what was lost inside it, the way a river carries the shape of the bank that formed it, even when the bank is long past. Ethan Callahan had lost a wife and a child in 3 years and the habit of believing that tomorrow would be different from today. He had not gotten any of that back. He would not. That was the part that did not heal so much as it changed form. From a wound into a knowledge, from an absence into an understanding of what presence had meant. What he had instead was this: a woman who said things plainly and thought clearly and argued when she thought he was wrong, which was more often than he expected and less often than she probably could have. 4 children who were becoming themselves on his land and in his daily life, and who had, through the simple accumulation of days, made him into someone they relied on in the way children rely on things they have decided are permanent. A baby who had gone from blue-lipped and barely breathing on his cot to a person with opinions and a method for getting them across. A notebook, kept by him and Nora together, in which the days of the returning land were recorded in 2 kinds of handwriting. A dog who had gotten his hearing somewhat back with the warmer weather, or possibly had simply decided to pay attention again. A hinge on the front door that was slightly crooked in its bracket, but functioned correctly and would probably outlast both of them, he thought, standing in his yard on that May afternoon. This is what I didn't know I was waiting for. Not a restoration, a continuation. Life insisting on itself through the smallest possible opening, a knock, a door, a man standing in the cold, deciding in half a second who he was going to be. Clara leaned against his shoulder, just slightly, not dramatically, just the weight of it, the familiar, comfortable weight of someone who has decided you're where they want to be. He put his arm around her. Across the yard, Lucy was showing Frank Alcott her wool socks. Alcott, to his credit, was examining them with apparent seriousness. She's going to talk about those socks for the rest of her life, Clara said. Probably, Ethan said. You know that, and you're still pleased about it. I am, he said. He was. The people who had turned Clara away in the cold of December, who had pulled curtains and locked doors and calculated the cost of being associated with a widow who had nothing. Some of them were here today, in his yard, eating Ellen Pryor's food and telling themselves a version of events in which they had not been quite so deliberate about their cruelty. People do that. It is one of the less admirable things about people, and also one of the more human ones, the revision of memory toward the version of yourself you can live with. He did not hold it against them entirely. He understood the arithmetic of self-protection. He had lived inside it for 3 years. He knew how convincing it was from the inside, the story that said you couldn't afford to let more in, that your margins were too thin, that your own survival required a sealed border. He just also knew that the story was wrong. Not always. There are real limits, real capacities, real winters that really will break you if you take on more than you can carry. He did not want to make a simple lesson out of a thing that wasn't simple, but he knew that in his case, in that particular cabin on that particular night, the story had been wrong, that he had had more margin than he thought, that the sealed border had been costing him more than it protected, that sometimes the person knocking is not a threat to what you have left. Sometimes they're the reason to have it. Thomas appeared at his other side, not touching, just present, in the way he'd developed of standing close enough to be counted as part of something without requiring the something to be named. Ethan looked at the boy. Thomas was looking at the ridge. He had his father's way of going still when he was thinking something serious, Clara had told him once. Robert Whitmore had gone still the same way, the body quieting to make room for whatever the mind was working through. "Good day," Thomas said. Not a question. "Good day," Ethan said. Thomas nodded. Then he went to help Will, who had gotten into some disagreement with a piece of rope that required intervention. Ethan stood in his yard with his wife beside him, and the May light moving across the land and the ridge throwing its long afternoon shadow toward them across the grass. And he thought, this is enough, not as a concession or a settling for less, as a fact. This, exactly this, is the thing that people are talking about when they talk about enough. Not the absence of difficulty, not the resolution of all the hard things into clean conclusions. Just this: the land, the light, the people in the yard, the small, persistent weight of a shoulder against his arm. The knock before dawn had cost him everything he thought he was protecting. It had given him everything worth protecting. He held his cup and stood in the May afternoon and let that be what it was, the whole truth, uncomplicated by anything he might wish had gone differently, and enough in the end to build a life on.